So say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I don't know research on this.
Hey there, YouTube. The Dapper Dinosaur here. So recently, Genesis Apologetics released their magnum opus. It's like an hour and a half long of nonsense. So let's see what's in there.
I am evolution. I am random chance accidents, the brainless, purposeless nothing, which somehow leads to everything.
After seeing this clip, I at first thought about asking if it were a legal requirement that creationists use strawman arguments about evolution. But then I realized that the only way you even can argue against evolution is either ignorance or dishonesty. So of course you have to strawman it.
I am creation. I show order and completion.
I had to break a few scientific laws to get here. The law of conservation of mass energy, which says new matter of energy can never be created nor destroyed.
No.
There is nothing in evolution that brings energy or matter into or out of existence. But you're probably trying to conflate evolution with the Big Bang.
The law of causality, which says that every effect must have an equal or greater cause.
You know, the only thing I could find out about a law of causality was in objectivist philosophy. And since I don't think Genesis Apologetics is cribbing notes from Ayn Rand, who was famously anti-religious, I think they're just making this up. But nothing in physics says that a cause has to be greater than an effect, whatever that means.
Yet I ask you to believe that everything came from nothing.
Oh, so we are conflating evolution and the Big Bang, I guess. Well, the Big Bang also doesn't claim that everything came from nothing. So what, you're 0 for 3 now?
Not to mention the law of biogenesis, which says that life always comes from life. Yet I teach that life came from non-living matter.
Well, so does creationism. Let's read some of Genesis 1.
God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And God said, Let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven. And God said, Let the earth bring forth the living creature after its kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind. And it was so."
And in Genesis 2, God creates man from the dust of the earth. In fact, in the whole Genesis narrative, the only time a living thing comes from living matter is when Eve is created from Adam's rib. So let's not point fingers at the scientific community for investigating the origins of life from non-living matter. But then again, you're also conflating evolution with abiogenesis, which certainly did not operate according to evolutionary principles, since evolution is a matter of population genetics, and before life, there were no populations with genetics.
I never go against these scientific laws, because I am created by the one who made the energy.
You go against the laws of general relativity, nuclear physics, chemistry, biology, meteorology, hydrology, geology, and history. But hey, who am I to judge?
The great cause that made all the effects, the living God who created life, matter, the laws of nature, and all things.
Maybe, but young Earth creationism is still incompatible with almost everything we know about science.
I am marked by an invisible past. Fossils show none of my expected in-between forms.
Except for these transitional forms.
I am witnessed in the book that tells how I came about, the Bible.
Unfortunately, that's not evidence in itself. You have to demonstrate that the Bible is correct. You can't simply assume it is because it says it is. Lots of contradictory books claim to be true. In order to find one to believe, you have to test it against reality. Reality is the standard on which we judge the Bible, not the other way around. Because otherwise, if we were ever wrong about the Bible, or even our interpretation of it, there would be no way to really know that.
I am talked about in almost every science textbook. Their information often changes and disagrees, but it's all the truth.
Well, no. Evolution is pretty much only talked about in biology texts, and sometimes geology texts or astronomy texts in the context of fossils and hypothetical alien biospheres. And of course the information changes. That's what science does in the face of new evidence. It corrects itself to conform to the data. Would you really prefer that science, upon getting a wrong answer that seems right, simply stick to the wrong answer after it has been shown to be wrong? I hope that's not your preference, because if it were, we'd still be stuck in the Iron Age.
My book has stood the test of time. Like the God that revealed it, my truth never changes.
Translation: if I'm wrong, I'll never know about it, and will refuse to ever change my mind, even if I can be conclusively shown to be wrong.
I am clever storytelling. If what you see doesn't fit with what I'm saying, we'll make it fit.
Whether or not evolution is clever storytelling, using that to contrast it with biblical creationism is laughable. No matter how true or false the stories in the Bibles are, they are just that. Stories. Evolution, on the other hand, is a theory which makes verifiable and falsifiable predictions, and which has not been falsified in well over a century, while making many correct predictions. It's true that scientists have been wrong about it and how it operates, but ultimately the hypothesis of universal common ancestry has been confirmed well past any reasonable standard of scientific evidence.
I only need a small amount of evidence to be considered true, because everyone wants to believe me.
Well, there are mountains of evidence for evolution. If you were to simply print out every paper and book published showing confirmed evidence for evolution since the publishing of The Origin of Species, you couldn't fit them all in your house, whereas you can fit everything put forth as evidence for young Earth creationism in a large bookcase. In fact, I personally own a good portion of such evidence in print form. Reading all of the literature in creationism that is of a technical level is something a human can accomplish in a few years of casual reading. No human can live long enough to read all of the technical literature showing evidence for evolution in even a small area of the topic. For example, just papers on de novo gene evolution would take years, given that a Google Scholar search for such papers returns well over 700,000 results. You'd barely have time to read the titles of those papers, never mind the papers themselves.
I am the search for truth, the narrow path.
You are the search for evidence that confirms your bias. And if you look hard enough for evidence to confirm any idea, you'll find it, so long as you're willing to ignore contrary evidence and other possible causes for the evidence you do find.
Sure. I've noticed this is one of the most heated battles, this whole dating issue.
It really isn't, though. It's only heated if you're a science denier. It's sort of like the heated debate over the shape of the Earth, climate change, or the efficacy of vaccines. There really isn't any debate over the major aspects of any of these things. The evidence in all those cases is overwhelming.
Well, that's because time is at the foundation for everything evolutionary theory teaches.
Only in that the pace of evolution is rather slow on a human timescale, so there needs to have been sufficient time for evolution to occur. But even if there had been special creation, evolution would still function as it does and has from that point on. So the process itself doesn't need there to have been lots of time, only the common descent part.
Look, just read this section right here.
Evolution takes a long time. If life has evolved, then Earth must be very fat. Old. Geologists now use radioactivity to establish the age of certain rocks and fossils. This kind of data could have shown that the Earth is young.
If that had happened, Darwin's ideas would have been refuted and abandoned. Instead, radioactive dating indicates the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old.
Well, universal common descent would have been dealt a significant blow. But even without radiometric dating, back in the 19th century, the Earth was known to have been at least a few million years old based solely on sedimentary rock and thermodynamic calculations. These would have been a problem for universal common descent, but it could also have allowed for far more evolution than most anti-evolutionists will accept.
Plenty of time for evolution and natural selection to take place.
Wow, it seems that the foundation of evolutionary theory sure depends on radiometric dating. Radiometric dating is used to support the belief that millions of years exist for evolution to happen.
Yep, and like they said, the entire age of the Earth rests upon radiometric dating. It sure seems that they're putting a lot of faith in something that they can't actually test through direct observation.
I have personally observed them and measured radioactive activity of many kinds, including beta, alpha, neutron, and gamma radiation. It's true that this isn't the same thing as watching a rock form and then sit underground for eons, but then, even if you had, it still wouldn't be direct, in the strictest sense of the word. Any observation animals make must be indirect because it is transmitted by some means other than that causing the observation itself to the brain, which must then process it. So radiometric dating is done with direct observation, but I suspect they mean that the time involved isn't directly observed, and if that is what they mean, then perhaps they should have worded this more carefully.
After all, plenty of assumptions go into these calculations.
If it were to be disproved, their whole worldview would seem to collapse. Without billions of years, you can't have biological evolution or geological evolution on Earth.
Well, common descent and modern theories of planetary formation would have to be reconsidered and heavily modified if radiometric dating instead showed a young Earth. On the other hand, if it just proved unreliable, then those theories have still made far too many predictions, and all without being falsified for us to completely abandon them. If radiometric dating is unreliable, we are still quite likely right within an order of magnitude about the age of the Earth, and are much closer to right about the age of the universe as a whole, a number which does not depend on radiometric dating at all.
Pretty epic, eh? So, based on their dating methods, they've come up with an age for each section of the geologic column that we find on the very next page.
And based on that, they determine the age of the Earth to be about 4.5 billion years old.
No, not really. The age of the Earth is based on radiometric dating of asteroids, not rocks from Earth. The reason for this is that rocks from the first formation of Earth are probably not extant, having all been recycled into the mantle of the Earth, which resets atomic clocks. However, this is not something that would happen to asteroids. Since current models of the formation of the solar system predict that asteroids and Earth formed essentially at the same time, at least on the timescales of geology, then if we find a meteorite and radiometrically date it, it should give a result that is about the same age as that of the Earth, and the other planets for that matter.
Actually, the age of the Earth is based on the dating of certain meteorites. They assume these meteorites formed at the same time as the Earth and that dating the meteorites will give us the age of the Earth.
Oh, so you knew that? Then why play dumb? Whatever.
With that as a start, they then construct the ages of the layers in the column based primarily on the layers of volcanic ash and igneous rock.
Wow, so they don't even use rock from Earth. I guess there is another something you don't hear about in class.
I mean, you should hear about it in class. I knew it off the top of my head, and it's not like it's a secret that the age of the Earth is primarily determined by dating asteroids. If you think that's a bad method, then you'll need to come up with a good reason why asteroids should differ significantly in age from Earth. Or tell us why radiometric dating is unreliable. I suspect you're going to attempt the latter.
So, for the test, could you remind me about how radiometric dating works?
Sure. Can you hand me my water bottle?
Wow, this thing's still half frozen.
Now, pretend the water bottle is a rock. Jane, what are you doing?
Pretending it's a rock.
Okay, well, rocks contain radioactive material called the parent element, or isotope, which decays into a non-radioactive stable product known as the daughter element, or isotope.
Well, that simplifies things a lot. Usually any given isotope will actually have a decay chain, such that it goes through several steps before it gets to anything stable, each step along the way emitting various particles, usually things like neutrons, beta particles, or alpha particles. For example, uranium-238 will undergo alpha decay and turn into thorium-234. This will then undergo beta decay to become protactinium-234, which then undergoes beta decay to become uranium-234, which then undergoes alpha decay to become thorium-230, which undergoes alpha decay to become radium-226, which undergoes alpha decay to become radon-222, which undergoes alpha decay to become polonium-218, which undergoes beta decay to become bismuth-214, which undergoes beta decay to become polonium-214, which undergoes alpha decay to become lead-210, which undergoes beta decay to become bismuth-210, which undergoes beta decay to become polonium, which undergoes alpha decay to become lead-206. Lead-206 is stable, and is the final decay product. But in a rock being radiometrically dated, we should see more than just uranium-238 and lead-206. We should see varying amounts of daughter products depending on their decay rate, and we should also see evidence of their decay, such as the reaction the released beta and alpha particles should have on the surrounding rock.
Okay, I remember now. So, It's like the ice that slowly melts into the water.
Yeah.
Maybe if the ice were going to turn into 13 distinct other things, all of which melt at their own different rate, and all of which can be measured at the same time, and which can't form into crystal matrices in situ if the ice had formed with the decay products in their particular locations you find them in at the time. So, no, actually, it's not very much like ice melting into water in a bottle. Not very much at all.
And in the biology book, there's a chart here that shows potassium-40 decaying into argon-40.
Okay, I see. So based on how we can measure it today, we assume that every 1.3 billion years, the amount of potassium-40 decreases by half.
This isn't just some assumption. Radiometric decay rates have been carefully measured and are governed by nuclear physics, which at its core is a subset of quantum physics. Quantum physics has proven accurate to a higher degree than any other theory in physics in terms of prediction versus measured results. For radiometric decay rates to vary would require the fundamental forces of the universe to vary, and if this happened, it would essentially be the end of the universe as we know it, as atomic nuclei would break apart and the universe would be bathed in a soup of helium plasma and antimatter. This is like saying that based on how we can measure gravity today, we assume that gravity in AD 33 was about the same, and that rocks still fell at 9.8 meters in a second if let go 10 meters above the ground. If that were not the case, it would mean all of science is completely invalid, and it would also mean that we should be seeing some evidence of these radical changes in the past. We don't.
Right, a radioactive half-life. So, when they discover a rock, they can measure the amount of parent material and the amount of daughter product, and using a chart like this, determine how old it is.
Well, at a very basic level, yes, but as I've already gone over in the last video, there's more to it than that.
So what's wrong with this method?
Well, the methods measure only the amounts of isotopes in the rock. This is good science because it is observable and repeatable. It just gives the ratio of one element to another. But the age is an interpretation of those measurements, not an observation. And that interpretation assumes answers to all kinds of untested questions. What if the rock already had a daughter isotope in it from the very beginning?
Whoa! It's like scientists who spent their whole lives studying geology, chemistry, and nuclear physics never thought to question if maybe something obvious got skipped over. Except that, no, they are aware of the question of initial circumstances. Fortunately, there are ways to check on this assumption. One is isochron dating, which involves checking numerous isotopes of various elements to determine the age, and in the equations used, initial starting conditions cancel out, so it doesn't matter what they were once the analysis is finished. Further, there are many rocks in which daughter products cannot be part of the original material, because they would be chemically excluded. In the example of potassium-argon dating, argon is excluded from forming crystals because it is a noble gas, and so is chemically inert. So any argon in the crystals making up the rock must have gotten there after the crystals formed. And since potassium does form such crystals, the only conclusion that doesn't involve magic is that the argon got there via decay of potassium.
Or what if the rock gets contaminated?
That's why you don't just test a single sample, you test lots of them. And when you do that and find a weird outlier, contamination is the likely reason.
Or what if the rate of decay was rattled at some point in the past?
Then physics would have had to be altered radically in the past to the point that matter could have well unraveled, and the universe would be, to this day, bathed in harsh radiation. Oh yeah, and all of science would basically be invalid.
What was the original ratio of parent to daughter isotope?
I feel like you already asked that, and that I already answered it. Are you eating apricot seeds like Kent Hovind? They'll rot your brain.
One must assume no parent or daughter material was added or removed from the rock, and that the rate of decay has always been constant over millions and millions of years.
Well, given that in most cases there isn't just uranium or potassium or lead or argon just laying around in piles all over the place, and that rocks aren't well known for sucking in material like a sponge, and that in many cases daughter elements entering the rocks and becoming part of the crystal structure is physically impossible, and that varying the rate of decay is essentially impossible without breaking physics, these seem like they're decent assumptions.
Are those assumptions wrong? I mean, if you start with false assumptions, you could get really bad dates.
Well, many scientists think they are, and our textbooks don't even tell us about all the assumptions required to date the rock.
Well, books for kids in school don't really have the space to tell you every underlying assumption to every principle. The fact is that these assumptions are so reasonable that they're barely worth mentioning.
But the most convincing evidence is all the crazy dates they get with radioisotope methods. I wonder if our teacher even knows all the assumptions behind radiometric dating. To be fair, there are lots of dates that agree with one another.
By lots of dates that agree with one another, he means the vast majority. when tests are done with proper controls. Radiometric dating methods overlap in range, and when we can test a rock with 2 or more methods, the dates almost always fall within each other's mutual range of certainty. The exceptions are when things like much older zircons are included in the rock being tested, so the test is essentially contaminated by older crystals that were included as intrusions when the rock in question was forming, or a later contamination from things like the person actually collecting the sample.
But there are many examples of different mineral components of a rock giving very different radiometric dates, and very often different isotope systems give different ages for the same rock.
Like I said, there are intrusions in the rocks. And since things like zircons are chemically distinct, if they aren't carefully excluded from samples being tested, then certain dating techniques will be off due to contamination. This isn't exactly some mystery to science. It's well known and can be controlled for.
So how can you know which one is the right age, if any?
By being careful with your samples and cross-confirming dates with other rocks from the same formation using multiple techniques. Basically, the same way you check any anomalous results. You use multiple data points.
And then there are rocks we know the age of, where we watched it cool from lava, that give radically older dates.
Really?
Yeah. A lava flow in a volcano of the North Island of New Zealand that happened in 1954 was dated to be 3.5 million years old.
Wow, that's really off.
I tried to look into the story, but the only places I can find anything about it are creationist sources, most of which go back to Andrew Snelling, a notoriously dishonest creationist geologist known for lying about sampling techniques, cherry-picking data, and generally being unethical as a scientist. So I trust his findings about as far as I can throw them, which, given my short arms, isn't very far. But still, why might a volcanic rock give wrong dates? Well, there are these things called xenoliths, and despite what you might be thinking, I promise, xenoliths won't burst through your chest, causing your crewmates to scream in shock and horror. See, different kinds of rock melt at different temperatures, and to reset the radiometric clock, rocks have to melt. So what happens if the rock that melts to form the lava pool in a volcano is hot enough to melt most of the rocks in the area, but those rocks contain small bits of rock with much higher melting temperature? Well, when the volcano erupts and new igneous rocks form, they will continue to contain older rocks, like the zircons we've already talked about. Assuming that these creationist sources are honest, which is a shaky assumption in the first place, the most likely cause of the discrepancy is failure to exclude xenoliths from the tested sample, perhaps simply due to higher than normal amount of xenoliths in the rock in question.
A volcanic bomb that blew out of Mount Stromboli in Italy in 1963 was dated at 2.4 million years old.
And that dated much older than it really was.
A 10-year-old rock from Mount St. Helens lava dome dated to 350,000 years and older.
These instances have the same problem as the first one. They only seem to exist on creationist websites, and yes, it's possible to get anomalously old dates with samples if one is not careful or cherry-picks anomalous results while ignoring the more numerous typical results. But even if this disproved radiometric dating completely, it would just mean that we do not have reliable absolute dates for the Earth's geology, not that the Earth is young. You could just as easily say that the Earth is much older than we think, and it would do nothing to change our estimates for the age of the universe. So even if all this is a problem for radiometric dating, it's not a problem for evolution.
If we can't trust radiometric dating on rocks that we can see formed, then how can we trust radiometric dating on rocks that we can see formed? Rocks that supposedly formed 1 million years ago.
I know, right? And there are so many other examples. Check this out. Okay.
What's this? You carry rocks in your backpack while you're jogging?
Hey, hardcore. Okay, this rock was taken from the Ono Formation near Redding, California, where millions of sea fossils have been found. This lower Cretaceous rock is supposed to be about 112 million years old, but the marine fossil stuck inside the mud rock, an ammonite, showed 36,000 radiocarbon years.
Sorry, I needed some whiskey because of that one, because that was stupid. But here we go. You can't carbon date a permineralized fossil because all the organic carbon is gone. So this is all meaningless, and it can be easily explained by contamination, perhaps even by human collectors, but possibly even by modern bacteria,
which tend to get into cracks and crevices in rocks. There's a reason carbon-14 dating isn't used on rock. It doesn't work. And that ammonite is rock.
How can a rock be 112 million years old if it holds a fossil of only 36,000 years using a different method?
It can't, and it doesn't. You're just too dumb to realize that you're using the wrong dating techniques. Techniques that couldn't even work in principle.
I wonder if either date is meaningful.
Seems kinda suspicious to me.
The date that is based on actual science and not intentional fraud is the meaningful one. It's suspicious that creationists would misuse scientific techniques in an attempt to dishonestly discredit them.
The evidence isn't seeming too rock solid.
Funny. Let me see your diamond ring.
You mean my purity ring?
It's got a diamond on it, doesn't it?
Sure, I mean, check it out. Aren't they brilliant? Hey, at the jewelry store, the sign said diamonds take billions of years to form deep beneath the earth.
I doubt that. Researchers find carbon-14 in diamonds.
Why is that important?
Radiocarbon decays quickly. It has a half-life of only about 5,730 years, so its maximum shelf life is only about 100,000 years before it becomes undetectable. And it might be impossible to contaminate an old diamond with young carbon.
Well, no, contamination is pretty easy. Surface contamination is very easy and can simply occur from holding the diamonds. The other thing is that carbon-14 happens from capture of radiation by nuclei, something that can occur in the depths of the Earth, where 1, diamonds form slowly, and 2, there is a lot of radioactive material occurring naturally. So in fact, we should expect a low level of C14 in diamonds, even if they did form slowly over millions or even billions of years.
Wow, so those diamonds must be younger than they think.
No, not necessarily. Especially since the diamonds were never alive, so carbon dating is actually an invalid technique to use on them in the first place.
So here's the real question. Why are any of these examples in our textbook?
Because they do nothing to invalidate radiometric dating.
This scale is reading an extra 15 pounds on it. It just wasn't calibrated, okay? Hey, that's kind of like radiometric dating. Maybe everyone's been trusting that it's accurate, but it's been giving them false numbers.
Yeah, especially when you misuse it, right?
With all the overwhelming evidence that it doesn't work consistently, I'm surprised that they present it with such confidence in our textbooks.
There is no particularly good evidence that radiometric dating is unreliable. It's known to be unreliable under certain well-known circumstances which are avoided when using radiometric dating.
Jane, it goes back to the original quote we read in the book. If they're wrong about dating rocks, then the entire evolutionary theory crumbles to pieces.
That's true.
That's true.
Except that it's not true. Not even a little bit. Evolution doesn't depend on the exact age of the Earth, it just depends on the Earth being old enough, and even without radiometric dating, we know it is.
None of us were there to verify the assumptions.
But God has provided a written account of history. And if you tally up all the chronologies and time cues in the Bible, the Earth is about 6,000 years old.
So we trust God's word instead of man's fallible dating methods.
It's like it says in Job 38:4. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. It's like God saying, you weren't there.
It should make you think. It should make you think about why it is that you insist on having an interpretation of the Bible that is at odds with virtually all of the physical evidence available.
Is it just me, or can things that evolutionists claim take long amounts of time actually happen very quickly?
Pangea? You mean the supercontinent?
Yeah, I was just reading about it for this week's homework. Let's see, it was page 162. Now, right here, they believe all the continents were together to form Pangea 225 million years ago.
But not everyone agrees, right?
Yeah, not everyone agrees. You know, people who don't know what they're talking about, like creationists, or who are just intellectually dishonest, like professional creationists, don't all agree. Although, oddly enough, some of them do, claiming that Pangea represents the antediluvian world.
True. Thousands of scientists believe in fast continental sprint rather than slow continental drift.
The speed of continental drift is dependent on the flow of the mantle underneath the crust. The mantle here is quite hot, but it is also under immense pressure and so exists in a state that, while technically liquid, is very close to a solid. The resistance to flow in a fluid is called its viscosity. Viscosity is measured in a unit called poise, which breaks down into centimeter gram seconds. The technicalities of exactly how that's measured isn't too important right now,
But for reference, the viscosity of water is almost exactly 1 centipoise. That is, 1/100th of a poise. The viscosity of honey is 12,200 centipoise. The viscosity of the upper mantle is about 2/6,500 quintillion centipoise. That's such a high number that you can't really conceptualize it. A liquid with that viscosity would be indistinguishable from a solid on a human timescale. You could cut it, saw through it, build a house out of it, and you wouldn't notice that it was a liquid and not solid in your lifetime. In fact, the blacktop that roads are made out of is actually a high viscosity liquid, one with a viscosity that is less than a quadrillionth that of the Earth's mantle. I want you to keep this in mind while creationists talk about the continents racing over the globe. They are trying to get the mantle to flow at these speeds.
One famous scientist by the name of Dr. John Baumgardner created a computer model for plate tectonics that thousands of geophysicists use to investigate Earth processes. His model has given us an understanding of how the continents split apart thousands, not millions of years ago.
Near as I can tell, Dr. Baumgardner is barely a geologist. He has, from what I can tell, published a total of 4 papers in over 30 years. That's barely a publication record at all. None of his papers have more than 100 citations. He was associated with the widely discredited rate study, and his professional work is at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, a nuclear weapons research facility, not a geology research facility. As a side note, I've been there. It's nice, but in the middle of nowhere. He hasn't published in a reputable journal in about 12 years as of the time of this video, so citing him as an authority is a bit of a stretch.
Oh yeah, isn't he the creator of Terra?
Yep. In 1997, the U.S. News and World Report reported Terra was created by a Los Alamos lab scientist, the world's preeminent expert in the design of computer models for geophysical convection, the process by which the Earth creates volcanoes, earthquakes, and the movement of the continental plates.
Terra is not a general-purpose geophysics model. It was explicitly designed to model a flood and arrive at an Earth like the one we see today. Like all creationists, Dr. Baumgardner set out with a conclusion in mind, designed a model to fit that conclusion, and then touted his model as evidence for his conclusion. A Google Scholar search for the model doesn't even turn up Baumgardner's Institute for Creation Research published paper as the top term. It has had no impact, and it is not a serious scientific model. Really, the fact that only the ICR was willing to publish it should be a big red flag, as they will publish about anything that supports their desired conclusion and that sounds scientific. They are the very epitome of a pseudoscientific rag that exists to give their agenda a veneer of scientific credibility it does not deserve.
Didn't he show that they can also move very quickly?
No, he claimed that they could. But remember that viscosity problem? Yeah, the amount of energy it would take to go from a Pangea to modern Earth in the time span of the flood of Noah would be enough to just melt the Earth. Which I suppose would lower the viscosity of the mantle, so he's got that going for him. Creationists never seem to be able to grasp the scale of the numbers involved in these models. It's kind of like flat earthers, no sense of scale. And to be fair, human brains aren't equipped to handle scales outside of their normal experience. So, their intuition breaks down really fast outside of their normal daily lives.
Right, but because the theory of evolution takes a long period of time to supposedly happen, many only accept uniformitarian ideas.
First, Uniformitarianism is simply the application of the scientific method to geology. It is simply the idea in geology that the physics of today are the physics of yesterday, and so if physics today can be observed producing a particular geological feature, then the parsimonious conclusion by default is that similar features in the past were produced by similar processes. Would creationists simply have us say that there's no correlation between physics now and in the past? I mean, they in fact would like that, since it's the only way to make a young Earth and special creation fit reality. That is, if reality isn't really all that real. But second, uniformitarianism was proposed by James Hutton in 1788. The theory of evolution, as we now understand it, was proposed in 1859, while its predecessor, Lamarckian evolution, wasn't formulated until 1800 or so, and wasn't really a firm idea until well into the 1830s. So, no, uniformitarianism isn't there to support evolution, it predates evolution. The fact that the two fit together well is just further testament that both are true.
Uniform a who?
Oh, it defines it right here. Geologists make inferences based on the principle of uniformitarianism. This principle states that the same processes that operate today operated in the past.
So they can determine the rate at which a river is currently cutting through a canyon and then use that to determine how old it is?
No, that would be stupid. They look at the evidence of erosion higher up in the strata to see what kinds of erosion were going on. They look at things like sediment deposited at the mouth of the river to see how much there is and how far it spread. They look at things like former riverbeds that might have been from the same river on the previous course. They look at how erosion-resistant higher layers above the current riverbed are. It's not nearly so simple as looking at the current river, seeing its current erosion rate, and then just fitting a line to that, and there you go. Now you know how old it is by when the erosion level intersects with 0 on the x-axis. Do creationists really have this low an opinion of geologists?
Correct. But what this principle refuses to take into account is the major catastrophic events of the past.
You're wrong. You're so wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong. You're wrong.
No, it doesn't, because modern catastrophes occur. And when we see the effects and causes of them, geologists can recognize such events in the geological record. That's why many features in the geology of Earth are explained by catastrophes. Perhaps the biggest such example are the Siberian traps, the record of the most devastating volcanic event in the history of life on Earth, when a continent-sized area of land simply opened up, letting lava flood over a huge portion of the Earth's surface, creating clouds of toxic fumes, rapid ocean acidification, climate change that makes the current climate crisis look mild, and resulted in the extinction of nearly everything alive anywhere on Earth. If that's not catastrophic geology, I don't know what would be.
Even many evolutionary geologists are starting to recognize the importance of regional catastrophes in understanding the geologic features on Earth.
That's not news.
Okay.
So, our textbooks say that rock layers take a long time to form.
Some kinds of rock form slowly, others rapidly. It depends. Those flood basalts from the Siberian traps probably formed quite quickly, but fine-grained shale can only form in slow-flowing water very slowly as it settles to the bottom and is compacted. It turns out the geologists know that not all rocks form at the same rate. Weird, right? Professionals in the field already took relevant information into account. It's almost like the last 300 years of scientific research weren't just wasted.
Have you heard about Mount St. Helens?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I haven't watched this yet, but I'm going to predict that we're going to hear her use the igneous rock and ash layers that formed after the eruption as evidence that sedimentary rocks can also form quickly, ignoring that sedimentation and the deposition of igneous material are completely different. She might also even point out that there's a canyon that formed, if by canyon we mean a largish ditch that's mostly straight, and that cut through soft, recently deposited ash, but maybe I'm wrong.
during the 1980s eruptions at Mount St. Helens, 200 layers of rock were deposited in 3 hours. Entire river systems were carved in a matter of months, right through 700 feet of hard rock.
So far, so good. I might just get this prediction right.
Examples like this cause geologists to rethink some of their previous ideas, and give biblical creationists great models for the flood of Noah's day.
Odd. She didn't even try to make the rapid rock formation argument. Without that, you haven't even made an argument, Jane. Rivers can cut through rock fast, especially if it's soft, which it was and which you lied about. So why bring this up at all? It doesn't help you get deposition of sediment any faster than geology normally says.
So imagine what a worldwide flood would do.
It would leave global graded bedding layers, salt the earth, cause the extinction of all multicellular life, most unicellular life, result in spillways all around the earth, and absolutely not result in canyons like the Grand Canyon in northwest Arizona. Okay, I imagined it. Now let's see how you imagine it, without knowing anything about geology on which to base your fantasy.
Exactly. So, here it says, these rock layers in the Grand Canyon were laid down over millions of years and were then slowly washed away by the river, forming a channel.
That's uniformitarian thinking again, isn't it?
Yup, if these rock layers took millions of years to form, then the bottom rock layers would be hard and brittle.
Wait, why? Rocks don't just get brittle as they age. Rocks aren't your grandmother's hip bone before she took that slip in the bathroom getting out of the tub. That's not how rocks work.
By the time the ones at the top would be deposited. But near Grand Canyon, all the layers are bent together. If they were bent together, well, they were hard. Snap.
Yep, I guess it's a good thing that rocks under pressure can undergo plastic deformation, even if they are hard and relatively brittle. See what I mean? If you're going to fantasize about the flood, you need to start with a background knowledge of geology. Of course, doing that would show you why the flood of Noah doesn't and can't explain any feature of the Earth's rocks,
But hey, that's just the price of not being wrong.
The rocks didn't shatter like they should have. They must have been bent together while they were soft and pliable. The whole stack.
No.
That means they were all deposited at about the same time.
What? No, it doesn't. Why would it mean that? It means that they were under pressure at the same time for a long time. This isn't hard. If they were all soft at the same time and got pressed together, they'd have mixed and we'd get more of that graded bedding, not stratified layers not arranged by size or density.
Not over millions of years. So what about the canyon itself?
Well, if the river slowly carved the canyon, then we should see all the material piled up in a river delta. But it's completely missing. In fact, about 1,000 cubic miles has been eroded to form the Grand Canyon. Where did it all go? If the canyon was slowly eroded by the Colorado River, an enormous delta should be found at the mouth of the river where it empties into the Gulf of California. But the delta only contains about 1% of the eroded material we would expect if the evolutionary explanation were true.
Well, it's not missing. It's just mostly well into the Gulf of Mexico, which is currently bigger than it was in the past. It covers more than 3,000 square miles and is more than 3.5 miles deep in places. The modern river delta is just a tiny portion of the total deposition area for sediment from the Colorado River. Further, at various times the river and the canyon flow the other way. So much of the sediment was deposited into the Pacific Ocean, rather than the Gulf of Mexico.
Unless it was carved by a massive catastrophe, which carried all the material away.
That's what I think.
Away to where? The sediment would still be somewhere. Floods don't just make sediment disappear. They aren't magic, although I guess the flood of Noah would have to be magical.
Check out what it says about fossils in our biology book. Even if an organism lives in an environment where fossils can form, the chances are slim that its dead body will be buried in sediment before it decays. So, animals have to be quickly buried in sediment so its cells can be preserved and then replaced by the surrounding minerals.
This is mostly correct, although environmental conditions can make this quickly covered mean over the course of years, not days. For example, the bottom of an anoxic lagoon or a sandy desert can preserve a body for years, allowing sediment to build up on top of it, whereas in an oxygen-rich swamp, it may take a flood to get sedimentation to happen quickly enough for any fossils to form at all.
Okay, so check out this fossilized clam.
You have fossilized clams in your purse.
Yeah, they hurt in my pocket. Anyway, so what happens to a clam when it dies?
No more homework?
No. They open up and their two shells separate. But this clam was fossilized before it had a chance to fall open or be pulled open by a scavenger.
No, it didn't. That clam is in fact open, although I do appreciate that it's actually a clam and not a brachiopod, something that most creationists don't even know isn't a clam despite being in a different phylum. When clams die, their muscles relax, as you'd expect. It turns out that bivalves use muscles to hold their shells closed, and that open is the relaxed position. But when a clam dies, and the muscles relax, the shell doesn't splay open. That requires various tissues to be ripped. Something you'd know if you ever shucked oysters or clams. In opening the shells to 90 degrees or in taking a shell off, you have to tear the tissues of the animal. So all that happened to this clam was that it died and opened, but it wasn't eaten before it was buried. This isn't that unusual.
They've also found fossils of a fish coming out of another's mouth. How quickly did that get fossilized?
I don't know offhand, but why does a fish dying while trying to swallow something too big for it and then being fossilized mean that it had to be fossilized too quickly for modern taphonomy to account for? Side note, taphonomy is the study of how fossils form.
Not fast enough.
Or what about a marine reptile caught giving birth?
Again, dying in childbirth then being fossilized isn't any harder to explain than dying in any other way and being fossilized.
And they found many dinosaur bones with red blood cells, soft tissue, proteins, and even DNA. How quickly would that have to be buried before it deteriorated?
And have it last for 70 million years? There's no way.
Here's the discoverer of that very soft tissue that they were talking about, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, talking about this very issue.
It is interesting in the note that the rates program that the Young Earth Creationist had, all of them actually agreed that the the isochron dating methods did indicate an old Earth, and that the physics was correct, except that they were trying to find a way to say that decay constants had changed. But they did acknowledge that these dates are accurate within the framework of the science that we know to be the case, as now. So I wanted to point that out. That
bugs me. Why would God try to trick us?
That's a question we've asked them before.
That's really demeaning. It's like, okay, we're going to give you a brain and we're going to make a world of order, because order is something God's known for. He's rational. He's consistent. So we're going to make this world of order, and then, wow, we're going to trick you by saying that all the rules that you can figure out with your brain no longer apply. I don't buy that. God's not the deceiver in this. And I think that young Earth creationists have to be really, really careful when they sit there and try to manipulate the data to support their worldview. That is not science. When I wear my science hat, I don't have beliefs. I have only data. It's very boring. Data can only do two things. It can either support or fail to support, or disprove. I guess that's three.
We really appreciate your time today for sure, but is this going to be how science is dealt with by arguing with individual creationists with their web pages?
I can't. I'm sorry, but I can't. It's a waste of my time. It's a waste of my energy. And I think it does not honor God to go down that road and follow that lineage. It's not important. If these guys would take half the energy that they spend trying to prove that the world is young and use it to change the world around them, feed the hungry, take care of the kids, get the cats off the street, anything, that our world would be so much better. But they waste so much time and energy and effort on disproving that the world is old. It's not a salvation issue. Get over it.
That is such a wonderful answer.
I get really frustrated sometimes because there's so many things that are so much more important than this. And it's like they're stubbing their toe on a toenail. And there's so many things that this energy could be used to greater good. And I think, again, tripping on this stupid little issue does not in any way honor God. What are they trying to do? It bugs me. It really bugs me because it's a huge waste. Can I say it's dinosaur DNA? No, I can't, because it can be anything else on the planet unless I have sequence. And sequencing the DNA we pull out of our bones has so far proven to be impossible. So can I say I've got DNA in my bones? Yes. Can I say whose it is? No. I mean, I can't say yes. I can say the data support the presence of DNA using 4 different lines of chemical evidence. Does it say whose DNA it is? No. Do we have blood cells? No, we do not have blood cells. I don't have the data to support that. We have round red structures that localize to the blood vessel channels. They have the morphological characteristics of blood vessels. They have a chemical makeup similar to what you'd expect blood cells to have. And I've never figured out why people are more focused on these little red blood cells than they are on the osteocytes, which are way cooler.
But all of these could have been fossilized during the worldwide flood.
No, because quite a few of them were deposited in environments that absolutely were not the result of a flood. Plus, there just wasn't a worldwide flood.
Right. Noah's flood would create many of the rock layers that stretch over entire continents and bury millions of creatures for us to find as fossils today.
No, it would create global layers of graded bedding, something that doesn't occur. It would also cause continent-scale spillways, something else we don't see. And fossils would be arranged quite differently if they were mostly the result of a single flood event. Nothing in geology, and I want to stress this, nothing at all is remotely compatible with the idea of a global flood.
It doesn't take millions of years to form fossils. It can happen rapidly under the right conditions.
Okay, but it usually doesn't, and you haven't even given reasons why most of your examples of unusually rapid fossilization were in fact rapid. Well, that's all they have for this section.
This book was published in 1925 by Sir Arthur Keith, and now he was the president of the Royal Anthropological Society of Great Britain.
Well, let's see. I'm making this video in 2019, and that book was published in 1925. That's 94 years ago. Why is this relevant? Oh right, it's not. If Piltdown Man mattered at all to science in the modern day as anything other than a warning that sometimes people are hoaxers, then they'd have a more recent citation. But no, they're going to go with a nearly century-old book. Oh well, let's see what they have to say about it.
In the skull?
It was found in 1912. Now, it called Piltdown Man the find of the 20th century. I think it was the New York Times said that it proves the theory of evolution. There were like 500 articles published when they first found this. Then in 1953, they discovered that the skull was a fake.
Yeah, it was definitively shown to be a hoax in 1953. That's 66 years ago as of the time of this video. So again, this isn't exactly an aspect of the history of the theory of evolution that has lots of relevance to the science of today. But even so, while it wasn't proven a hoax until 1953, Piltdown Man was increasingly relegated to an oddity that didn't fit other data that was being gained at the time. And even when it was discovered, it was controversial, despite the hyperbolic headlines about it.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah. They took chemicals and they aged the skull. They made it look like it was really, really old. And then the jaw is actually from an orangutan. And the guy who discovered it, he actually filed the teeth down and made it look real.
Not quite. I'm not sure why you'd pretend that the identity of the hoaxer is known and that it was the discoverer of the composite skull. But in fact, no one knows who hoaxed it, or really why.
What the heck were scientists thinking?
Well, they were thinking that a fossil that seemed to confirm some predictions of an already well-supported theory didn't seem too crazy. And since it was found in England, and nationalism was strong in Europe at the time, the British scientists thought it would be cool if humanity had evolved in the British Isles. But of course, when it was found, lots of scientists were extremely skeptical, and then they kept investigating because of skepticism, and eventually proved the skull to be a hoaxed composite. This seems like a pretty normal initial enthusiasm, followed by also normal scientific inquiry, that eventually led to the hoax being exposed. What would you like scientists to have thought?
Have you ever heard of Nebraska Man? Nebraska Man was the first American ape man fossil to be discovered, and Harold Cook found just a tooth.
Okay, so now we're talking about a tooth discovered 97 years ago, and the primate identification of which was withdrawn 92 years ago. Starting out really strong with some current science there, guys. And of course, just like the last thing you talked about, the scientific community was never overly taken with this find because it was so fragmentary. But come on, try to explain why a tooth that was never taken very seriously is a problem for the evolution of humans, keeping in mind that things that aren't evidence for the evolution of humans aren't by that fact alone evidence against it.
Bet that made for some news or museum display.
Yeah, well, it was big enough for the New York Times.
You know what the New York Times has never been? A peer-reviewed scientific journal. Their goal is, and has always been, to sell copies of their paper. Despite claiming to be the newspaper of record, the New York Times is not a trustworthy reporter of science news. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it was even less so nearly a century ago when facts were harder to check, and consulting with experts in any given field for articles was even harder.
Okay, and then it went viral for back then, and the London News did a whole drawing on it from a single tooth.
Huh, the London Times. Is that a scientific journal? Let me check. Nope. Again, just a newspaper looking to sell copies. So far, you're presenting a find that's nearly a century old, and you're presenting newspaper clippings about it from that time as evidence that it, is still important to the current understanding of human evolution?
There's still a picture of him on Wikipedia.
They drew all that based on a tooth?
Yep, there's still the picture from the London Times on the Wikipedia page. You know, the page that presents it as a minor find that was never taken seriously. You know, Wikipedia maintains pages on a lot of hoaxes, right? As long as they are historically significant or just sufficiently well known, then there's probably a Wikipedia page on it. There being a Wikipedia page about something doesn't mean that it's still a part of current science. There are also Wikipedia pages about the luminiferous aether and Aristotelian physics, but those aren't exactly cutting edge either. And yes, an artist who wasn't a scientist made up a picture based on pretty much nothing. A picture that was never published as part of any scientific description or reconstruction associated with the tooth in question. Artists can do whatever they want, and this particular picture was never taken seriously as a reconstruction by anyone in the scientific community, because it was obviously based on almost nothing, and wasn't even presented as scientific.
Yeah, but 10 years later they discovered out that that tooth was actually from an extinct pig.
Wrong again. It was 5 years later that additional parts of the original skeleton were identified, and it wasn't a pig. It was a peccary. Pigs in the broad sense are members of the family Suidae, and are native to the Old World, that is Eurasia and Africa. Peccaries are members of the family Tassaeuidae and are native to South America and southern North America. They are similar animals and are sister groups, but they are distinct in many ways, most noticeably the growth of the canines, the number of toes, a more complex stomach than those of pigs, and suborbital scent glands in peccaries that are lacking in pigs. If you live in Texas or the American Southwest, you may have encountered the animal called a javelina. This is a peccary.
No way.
Yeah, so Piltdown man was the popular proof for evolution for 40 years, and Nebraska man was the popular proof for 10.
Do you mean 23 and 5 years? I mean, you can't even get simple arithmetic right. And neither was the proof of evolution, as if evolution, one of the best supported theories in science ever, rested on a single fossil. Both were never terribly well received, and neither was proof for evolution, despite the reportings of sales-hungry newspaper reporters.
Makes you wonder about what they're teaching us today.
I'm way ahead of you. Take a look at my little brother's 6th grade history book.
Really? Your brother's book? You have way too much time on your hands. Well, some of these ape men look familiar.
Long lost relatives of yours? No, I'm just kidding, but no, it's because they're in our book as well.
Oh, well, in our book, they say Australopithecus afarensis evolved 3.8 to 3 million years ago. But in the 6th grade book, Australopithecus evolving 4 to 5 million years ago.
What do you want me to say? That school textbooks always get things right? I don't even know what the publication dates are for those books. Although I can say that the 6th grade one is further from right than the one you say is yours, and is presumably meant for high schoolers. Textbooks aren't peer-reviewed journals, they aren't authoritative, and unfortunately they aren't kept as up-to-date as they should be, and are generally approved by people who lack the expertise to judge how well they do on such things, except in the broadest sense.
Uh-huh. Now, look at this. This is an old 1951 Life magazine publication.
Life magazine? Why are we looking at this? This is even less relevant than your undated and unnamed, but seemingly real children's textbooks.
According to this, Australopithecus lived 1 million to 500,000 years ago.
Wow, some magazine from the 50s doesn't agree with the current scientific consensus on the dating of an extinct species? Well, I guess evolution is disproved. Time to pack it all in. Sorry it all ended this way, everyone.
Thanks for watching. But before you go, I'd like to take a few moments to thank my patrons, especially my $20 patrons, Bob Knob and Res Instance.
Wait, no, that's stupid. Why are we examining non-scientific sources from decades ago?
Wow, that's different by a few million years. These dates are all over the place.
Yeah, well, it gets worse. So this is our biology, the Holt biology book.
Okay.
And it shows Homo habilis as living 1.6 to 1.9 million years ago. But in the 6th grade one, it's 2.4 million years ago.
So which one's true?
I guess it depends on which class you're in.
Or, you could check actually current and scholarly sources on the matter, rather than relying on books for children from who knows when.
So, what I'm wondering is if any of these dates are correct.
It looks like today's truth is just tomorrow's fiction.
Translation. The fact that science will update itself to conform to new data and thereby get closer to the truth, even if it can't reach it, scares me. Because it means I might have to change my beliefs with the arrival of new evidence. But I don't want to do that because I've been taught that if I don't believe in a flood that didn't happen, God won't like me. Well, spoilers. If God exists and he's just, he's not sending you to hell for accepting reality. And if he does, well then you're already wrong about him anyway. So it looks like you're in a bad way no matter what by not accepting reality.
If you look back at all the textbooks, they're all published at about the same time.
About the same time? What does that mean? You've been citing sources from anywhere from more than 90 years ago to more than 50 years ago. So to you it seems like the same time could mean almost anything. And were there any major discoveries between those times of textbook publication? I can't even find out, because you didn't actually give any dates. And quite frankly, digging up information based on a few frames of the covers of textbooks about what those textbooks are and which edition they might be is more work than I'm going to do for a point that doesn't even matter in the first place.
Take a look at my little brother's 6th grade book. Now this book shows all of the popular fossils today.
Okay, so here we are, Homo sapiens, right?
But check out what came before us.
Homo erectus.
Right, and while he had a human body, evolutionists like to point out that he had a different skull, at least a modern human skull. Now, the journal Science, back in October of 2013, they reported they found skulls in Georgia, like Russia. It shows how different the Homo erectus skulls can look.
Wow, they are so different.
Yep, Homo erectus was a very diverse species, and Homo sapiens is a very homogeneous species. In fact, H. sapiens has an unusually low genetic diversity among mammals, which is why most scientists conclude that H. sapiens suffered a genetic bottleneck in the past few tens of thousands of years.
Homo erectus and human skulls can be very similar.
H. erectus skulls are human, but if by human you for some reason mean H. sapiens, then some of them are more similar to H. sapiens than others, but none of them are H. sapiens, lacking some of the diagnostic criteria such as sufficient cranial capacity or chin structure.
In fact, they did a study on 202 modern-day Aborigines, like Australians, on the shape of their skulls, and they found that 14 of the 17 traits were the same on the Aborigines as on the Homo erectus skulls.
What study? Where? Which traits? And the fact is that while Australian Aborigines have robust skulls compared to the average for H. sapiens, they are not consistent with an identification as H. erectus, having cranial and jaw structure characteristics of H. sapiens. All of the sources I can find even claiming there to have been a study are on creation websites. And even then, they focus only on traits known to vary considerably between both species, such as cranial vault thickness.
So, it looks like Homo erectus wasn't becoming human, but was already human?
Yep, along with H. neanderthalensis, H. ergaster, and H. sapiens. Generally, anything in the genus Homo is considered to be human, and unless H. ergaster is identified with H. erectus isn't ancestral to H. sapiens anyway. And even if it were, it's only a single population that gave rise to H. sapiens. All the other populations that spread throughout Europe, Asia, and the rest of Africa, and into the Pacific Islands, did not leave descendants.
Exactly. The next ape-man back is Homo habilis. Homo means human.
So you already know that all members of the genus Homo are human. Huh.
So they're trying to make him look more human-like than he really is. So Richard Leakey is a famous evolutionist, and he said, of the several dozen specimens that have been said at one time or another to belong to Homo habilis, at least half of them don't, but there is no consensus as to which 50% should be excluded. No one anthropologist's 50% is quite the same as another's. So they can't even really classify which fossils are supposed to go into which category.
It's almost like the transitional character of hominid fossils is so strong that it is stretching the artificial genus and species definition of taxonomy to near breaking point, since there's no way to assign a fossil to more than one species. Of course, this is just creationists now complaining that there are too many intermediate fossils, and that the fossils are so strongly intermediate that it's hard to put them into nice little boxes. You can't really win with creationists. On the one hand, they'll say that there are no transitionals. Then, when they can't really say that because of how many there are, they'll complain that those fossils are so transitional that they can't put them into neat little boxes of human and not human.
In fact, some scientists are fighting to have Homo habilis reclassified as Australopithecus.
Yeah, because it's so transitional that it's not clear which of the two artificially defined genera it should be in. I mean, are you trying to make the case for or against evolution? Because complaining that a fossil is too intermediate for evolution to be true doesn't really make any sense.
Which one?
Australopithecus is Lucy.
Oh yeah, I've heard of her.
Yeah.
Lucy was a single individual of one Australopithecus species of several. She's not the example of Australopithecus.
Now, Donald Johanson, 1973, discovered just the shin and the leg bone. Now, the way they line up makes scientists think that she could walk upright.
Mm-hmm.
There's a picture of her.
Wow, there's a lot of her missing.
Not really. Apes, like most bilaterians, are very symmetrical. And so because different parts are missing on different sides, we actually have most of the skeleton of Lucy. It's true that if you ignore this symmetry, then we have less than half of her. But since scientists are generally not great fools, they neither ignore symmetry nor choose the cup with deadly iocane powder in it.
Hey, at least it's more than a tooth.
It's true.
You want to see the fragments of the skull that they found?
Sure.
All right, wait for it. Booyah.
Wow.
That's what they found.
Not that much.
Yeah, when you put skull fragments of a small skull In a bag, they don't take up a lot of volume. But if you know how to put a skull together, you can see that that's actually a pretty significant portion of the skull. And of course, Lucy isn't the only specimen of Australopithecus afarensis that is known to science. And some of them have much more complete skulls.
Man, there's a lot of skulls in here. Was your grandpa a witch doctor?
No, he was a yard sailor. Now, looky what we have here.
A reconstruction based on a fossil and an overexposed mess of white pixels?
We have here a modern bonobo monkey skull, and we have Lucy. So the brown pieces are the actual fragments of Lucy's skull that they found.
Yep, reconstructed with data from other A. afarensis skulls, not just Lucy. Go on.
Well, they look so alike.
Yep, bonobos have a pretty stock standard basal hominid skull, whereas humans have rather derived and unusual skulls. Unsurprisingly, the earliest members of the human line are rather basal, as you'd expect. So again, is Lucy too transitional? Is that the problem?
Her brain is only a third the size of a modern human's, about the average chimp brain size, and she only stood about 3.5 feet tall.
Yep, Lucy is pretty close to the common ancestor of Pan and Homo. Good job figuring that one out. Not sure why you think this would be a problem for evolution, since that's exactly the sort of thing that was predicted by evolution.
Take a look at the way that Lucy has been portrayed in, the media, books and films, online.
Oh, she's been portrayed as an upright walking basal hominid? Seems about right. Although I noticed that at least one of those reconstructions was of a male Australopithecus, and so definitely wasn't Lucy.
Wow.
Everywhere.
They really went out of their way to make her look human-like.
Not particularly. She's covered in thicker hair than typical for humans, but more in line with the still sparse hair of chimpanzees and bonobos. She has a flat nose, heavy brow ridges, no defined chin, etc. The only particularly human aspect of her is her upright walking, which is known to be accurate. All the other things that make her seem human are actually just part of being a great ape, and are common to all great apes, including humans, since humans are great apes.
Take a look in our other biology book.
Oh, wow. Hey, look at the whites of those eyes. You know, I've been to a lot of different zoos, and I've seen a lot of different apes, and each of them have completely brown eyes.
While white sclerae are a near universal characteristic of human eyes, other apes also have them. See? These are all the eyes of non-human apes. There's no way to know for sure what color Lucy's eyes would have been, but it's not unreasonable that A. afarensis might have had a higher proportion of white sclerae than seen in other apes, since modern humans are nearly all that way. It's speculative, but not really misleading.
And not the eye whites that us humans have. Man, it even looks like she's thinking about something.
Yeah, bananas. I don't think they found any eyeball fossils, but if you wanted to make an ape man look more human, changing the colors of the eye whites in pictures is a good way to do it.
That's true.
Here's a picture of what she probably looked like.
No, that's a picture from the Creation Museum, owned and operated by Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis organization. And while I can't fault the color used, the posture for that reconstruction is completely wrong. Lucy could not have knuckle walked like that reconstruction, and this is even more clear when one takes into account the other fossil finds of her species.
Man, what a difference.
Yeah, well, they do say they have found several complete skeletons of the Australopithecus, though not specifically Lucy.
Wait, so you're aware that Lucy is just one early find of many? Then why have you been treating her like she's all we know of the genus? This is an example of why I think professional creationists are dishonest.
They found around 362 actual specimens from the species Australopithecus, specifically Lucy. However, Charles Oxnard said, the Australopithecines known over the last several decades are now irrevocably removed from a place in the evolution of human bipedalism. All this should make us wonder about the usual presentation of human evolution in introductory textbooks.
Hey, a quote without a reference, meaning I just had to spend like a half hour digging through creationist websites, Amazon, JSTOR, etc. just to find out that this is from an out-of-print book from 1988, not even a paper, which I at least could have accessed online. But no, a book that has no digital edition. Nice. But even so, I know it's from The Order of Man, a biomathematical anatomy of primates, and Oxnard's claim is simply that Australopithecines were not directly ancestral to the genus Homo, but they are a basally branching sister group to it. His views have largely been displaced as more and more early Homo and late Australopithecine finds have been unearthed.
Well, now you understand why I've been digging through this chest. I mean, really, the way it looks is that Lucy's just an extinct ape.
And you're just a living ape. But she's an extinct ape that, while still rather basal, shares some important traits with you, and is in a line of apes showing more and more distinctly human traits.
I'm kind of feeling angry. Like I've been duped.
Same thing with Neanderthals. Check out these illustrations that came out after they started finding Neanderthal fossils. Check this one out. This was published in the Illustrated London News about 100 years ago.
Newsflash, century-old paleo art isn't accurate. I feel like most people knew this already, but whatever.
Whoa. Okay, that's pretty brutish.
Now, do you want to know what they think he looks like now?
Sure.
Gee, a species of humans that's extremely closely related to Homo sapiens looked a whole lot like H. sapiens? It's just what we'd expect based on evolution, so evolution must be false.
Wow.
Just recently, scientists have discovered that Neanderthals buried their dead. They worked with tools, they wore makeup, they controlled fire, and they even found in a cave in Israel that Neanderthals and humans were living together and building families together.
Yeah, they were humans, and a sister group to your species. It's not really far-fetched to think that they shared a lot of similarities with your species. Although in recent years, some of those things, like makeup and ritual burial of the dead, have come into question.
Okay, you know what? That settles it. That settles it. If they can live together, and if they have children together, then Neanderthals are just humans, but the difference is that their appearance varies.
Yeah, they're just humans. Humans of a different species, and the reproductive compatibility with H. sapiens is exaggerated. Based on the complete lack of evidence of a Neanderthal Y chromosome ever being passed to any hybrid offspring, it seems like only some Homo sapiens Neanderthal crosses were viable. And it may have been the case that Generation 1 hybrids were of only limited fertility, and perhaps more fertile with one species than the other. Closely related species usually have some form of limited interfertility. You know, another one of those predictions of evolution.
Just like different people groups today can vary.
Yes, but we have the DNA of Homo neanderthalensis. They were not just variant Homo sapiens.
So either these fossils are completely human, or completely ape with nothing in between.
No, they're all completely ape, because humans are completely 100% apes, just like they're 100% primates, 100% mammals, 100% vertebrates, etc. And some of them are humans, in that they're in the genus Homo. But here's a lineup of skulls in the human lineage. Tell me where there's a line between human and not human. How did you make that determination?
Now, a specimen is basically any piece of bone, including teeth, that they find. All the specimens from all the different ape men that they've actually found, you can fit them in the back of a small pickup truck.
I have no idea how you determine this. But so what? You can fit the bones of a lot of animals in a pickup truck bed if the bones are broken and you pack them well. This doesn't mean we don't have plenty of evidence to reconstruct hundreds of individuals and dozens of species very well. We can and do, and they show the predicted transitional features expected by evolution. Well, after this they just start talking about the Genesis account and a passage from 1 Corinthians.
Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors, but have lost much or all of their original function due to different selection pressures acting on the descendant.
I feel like they're going to forget the much part of this definition, but yeah, that definition is pretty good, because it explains vestigial organs can and do still have functions.
So they're saying that animals and people have leftovers in their bodies that once served a function in our evolutionary ancestors? Hey, just like the parts for my car.
Exactly. The example they give here is the dolphin's hip bones.
They're saying its ancestor used to walk on land, but once the dolphin evolved to live in water, it has useless leftover hip bones.
No, it has hip bones that no longer serve the primary purpose of hip bones, that is, to support the legs so that they can bear weight, allowing for locomotion. It doesn't mean that they serve no purpose. You just read the definition.
What's funny is scientists recently discovered that marine animals, like whales, need these bones during mating season. The study was published in a 2014 article in the science journal Evolution.
Wait. The name of the journal is Evolution.
Yep.
The one that claims they've discovered a purpose for these bones, which goes against the whole idea that these bones are mere evolutionary leftovers.
What do you mean by mere? They obviously are evolutionary remnants of pelvic and limb bones, as we can see from embryology. In fact, let's take some time to look at this. First, How do we know that these bones are in fact hip bones? Well, as you can see with these tetrapod embryos, tetrapod limbs develop 4 limb buds, 2 for the forelimbs and 2 for the hind limbs. This includes cetaceans. Leg bones such as the femur, as well as pelvic bones, form in and medial to the limb buds. In cetaceans, these stop growing early on and are enveloped by the growth of the rest of the embryo, but then develop into the bones we see identified as the pelvic bones and the femur in cetaceans. So we know that this is what they are. Why would any of this go against evolution? Evolution never says that in reducing the primary function during evolution, a structure must lose all function, or can never gain new functions. This is just a creationist straw man.
That there's the definition of irony, isn't it?
So, in the textbook, they call them useless, but in reality these bones help the dolphin reproduce and survive.
Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors, but have lost much or all of their original function. Exactly, and they say the same thing about humans.
That we have dolphin hips?
Not exactly, but close. They point out that our coccyx, the tailbone, is left over from when we had tails.
And it derives embryonically from the same structure that in other tetrapods grows into the post-anal tail.
They think we used to have tails?
Yeah, but it's just the end of our backbone. I mean, it has to end somewhere, right?
Apologies, biological units. Dinosaur Depper asked the cat to replace him for a segment as he said he needed a break. To the point, the backbone could end without having developed from an embryonic tail, but then that would make humans look like they did not evolve from earlier ancestors by violating the laws of embryology, thereby making the special creation hypothesis more likely. But we suppose when your creator specially created humans, he wanted them to look exactly as if they had evolved from more basal animals, just to deceive you.
True. It's also the anchor for a bunch of muscles, right?
Yes. Tiny muscles, tendons, and ligaments connect to it, and it supports something called the pelvic diaphragm. This whole system holds a bunch of muscles and organs in place, like the bladder.
Right, and none of that makes it not a vestigial tail, since it's reduced and no longer serves the purpose of a tail, which in most mammals is balance.
So, what other things did they say are leftovers?
The tonsils.
Of course. Lots of people had their tonsils removed. Great way to get ice cream for dinner.
You seriously let them cut out your tonsils just so you can have ice cream?
Well, it depends on what kind of ice cream we're talking about here. Okay, not really. But people survive just fine without tonsils, right?
Studies now show that in some cases, removing your tonsils can be worse in the long run, and especially for young children.
From what I can tell, after healing from the surgery to have them removed, there's no significant difference in outcomes. But there are risks associated with the surgery, like all surgery, so it's not recommended that you have them removed unless it's necessary. Also, I couldn't really find any specific current sources claiming that tonsils were vestigial, just that they're not terribly useful. That's not really the same thing, since they still seem to function for their original or ancestral purpose, which is to say that they're basically just big lymph nodes. They're just not very good at being lymph nodes.
So, what's their purpose?
Tonsils are placed at the back of the throat so they trap germs when we breathe. Proteins called antibodies produced by immune cells in the tonsils help kill germs and prevent throat and lung infections.
Yeah, as part of the lymphatic system, they produce immune cells on their surface which can eliminate pathogens that contact them. But the problem is that they don't statistically reduce the infection rate in any easily measurable way, so there's not much point.
They actually manufacture antibodies against disease. They're basically the first line of defense against inhaled or ingested viruses.
Well, kind of like the way that a shirt worn over a Kevlar vest is the first line of defense against getting shot. It's technically true, but not in a way that really seems to matter.
So what about the appendix? It's thought to be vestigial, right? I'm not even sure I know what it is.
It's a tube-shaped sac attached to the lower end of the large intestine. It's part of your digestive system, and
But they also have purpose?
Yes. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors, but have lost much or all of their original functions. It's the storehouse for beneficial bacteria. When you fight an intestinal disease, your body gets rid of bacteria, both good and bad. But then the appendix can quickly resupply your system with good bacteria.
Sounds pretty helpful.
Yep. It also plays a role in our body's immune system, especially when we're younger.
Sounds pretty important.
It's not very important, and it's also not very good at allowing gut bacteria a place to ferment cellulose so that we can gain energy from it, which is the purpose of the organ in other animals that have it. It's also pretty small compared to animals that use it for cellulose digestion, so it's vestigial.
Charles Darwin thought vestigial structures were a winning argument for evolution.
He was right, because designers don't usually just stick some old beat-up version of a part that normally does one thing and then just kind of jury-rig it so it does something else, unless they have no choice. But then maybe God just has no imagination, so he has to use a fermenting chamber as a lackluster lymph node? Or, and hear me out here, or these things are the result of descent with modification, which has to fundamentally work with what's already there.
And he believed there were lots of vestigial structures?
Yeah, and a German anatomist by the name of Robert Wiedersheim made a list of 86 vestigial structures in the human body. And later, evolutionists expanded the list to about 180. But modern science has now shown that every one of them has a purpose. Vestigial structures are inherited from ancestors, but have lost much or all of their original function.
So they didn't know about these organs' functions in the body?
They may or may not have, but whether they have a current function or not isn't what makes things vestigial, although I'm sure they got some of that list wrong since scientists get things wrong.
No, they assumed that since people could survive without them, that these were totally useless. Then they reasoned in a circle, arguing that since they were useless leftovers of an evolutionary past, they demonstrate our evolutionary past.
So reasoning in a circle is bad.
Yep, it is bad. Good thing that nothing about noticing that homologous structures in some lines are no longer used for the ancestral purpose and are now reduced in size and function is circular reasoning.
Yeah, it's when we assume our conclusion, then use that assumption to prove our conclusion. It's crazy.
Psychological projection is a defense mechanism in which the human ego defends itself against unconscious impulses or qualities, both positive and negative, by denying their existence in themselves while attributing them to others. For example, a person who is habitually rude may constantly accuse other people of being rude. It incorporates blame shifting and can manifest as shame dumping. I'm not sure why I said that, but whatever.
So what do modern evolutionists say about these organs, now that science has discovered that every one of them have functions after all?
They now claim that vestigial organs can have functions after all.
Just like your textbook said all along. And this is yet another reason why professional creationists are dishonest. You actually started this video out saying that vestigial structures could have function, immediately shifted the goalpost, and are now claiming it's science that shifted the goalpost. I think I'm seeing now why I read the definition of projection.
And those functions may have evolved after the organ spent time being useless.
Wow, talk about imagination. It's kind of sad that they think we're made up of useless parts, instead of acknowledging the design by Jesus, the creator.
No one thinks that.
Is it just me, or has the evolution from one kind of animal into another ever been seen?
Well, unless you're about to give an objective way to tell what a kind is, one which can be confirmed or falsified using objective data, then I'm going to say that no one has seen a change from one kind of animal to another for the same reason that no one has seen the change from one animal Cefeltidad to another animal Cefeltidad, because there's just no such thing as a Cefeltidad. Alternatively, we could just say that a kind is a clade that is not part of any larger clade, but then, by definition, life would never leave its ancestral clades, and so we couldn't see anything leave its kind, and evolution would say that there is only one kind on Earth. Life kind.
So Darwin's finches left South America, traveled to the Galapagos Islands, and over time, each island developed its own species. But is that really evolution?
Well, I wouldn't say that each island developed its own finches, rather the finches diverged to adapt to their different environments. The islands are a bunch of rock and dirt. They're not doing much of anything beyond existing. But yes, this is evolution, because biological evolution is at a minimum any change in allele frequency in a population. Alleles being variations for a gene. For example, humans have two common alleles for earwax consistency, dry and wet. If the proportion of dry versus wet earwax alleles were to vary across time in the human population, that would be evolution. It's not much evolution, but it's evolution.
Your smartphone is pretty amazing, but it can only do things it's programmed to do. Hey, that's it! That's the difference!
What's the difference?
I've been reading through a textbook, and they keep giving great examples of how creatures change, like Darwin's finches, or these tortoises. But this isn't evolution by natural forces.
I suppose it's evolution by supernatural forces? Are there ghosts on the Galapagos Islands changing the flora and fauna there?
If these animals were programmed to adapt like that.
What do you mean programmed? Programmed behaviors are entirely predictable if you know the status of all inputs. So can you predict the method of adaptation of animals to new environments? Where is this predetermined adaptation to be found? Because I'll tell you right now, it's not already in the genome of existing animals, except in the slightest degree. The ancestors of those tortoises did not have the alleles or even genes to take on their present form in their genomes.
I see what you're saying. Many evolutionists consider any change as evolution, which makes it seem like we're always evolving upward, but...
No, only changes in the genome are evolutionary. Many organisms can make minor changes to their bodies to respond to environmental stress without there being an underlying change in the genotype. For example, dogs shed more when it's hot, plants grow more slowly when it's dry, and tardigrades can desiccate themselves and shrink when there is not enough water or food for them. None of this is evolution, but it's all change. Further, the theory of biological evolution makes no value judgment on the changes it describes. I know that the Great Chain of Being is still a sort of background feature of Western culture, and has been ever since Plato and Aristotle, right through into medieval Christianity, which adopted it and shoved a Christian theology into it. But the theory of evolution has no place for ranking organisms as higher or lower. It's true that older works, including Darwin's Origin of the Species, use terms like higher forms, but that's not current science.
Not all changes come from accidental errors through mutation. Some pre-programmed variation helps animals adapt through genetic recombining.
And how did those variations get there? Let's just assume that the Noah's Ark story is true as accepted by young Earth creationists, even though it obviously isn't, and it's right up there with flat Earth and vaccines causing autism in terms of sheer wrongness. So we have, according to most creationists, 2 wolves or wolf-like animals. And now we're just going to focus on modern wolves, which descended from them. And just on their mitochondrial DNA. Because all of these wolves descended from a single she-wolf that got off the ark, they all have her as their mitochondrial Eve, which means every single allele in mitochondria in wolves is the result of a mutation. But wolves are divided into 9 mitochondrial haplogroups, each of which is subdivided into dozens of subgroups, all of which have their own internal variety. So we know for a fact that even just looking at mitochondrial DNA, all of this variation had to result from mutation, even if the flood happened. Which it didn't. But it gets worse. We could only have at most 4 alleles for any locus on the nuclear DNA in the founding pair of wolves off the ark. But wolves have a large diversity in their nuclear DNA too, and if we accept what most young Earth creationists say, and say that all modern canines are descended from this Noah's Ark pair of canines, then we have to include all the diversity of modern canines, and clearly we run into the problem that there are orders of magnitude too much genetic variation for it to have been primordial to the ancestral pair. The vast majority of canine genetic diversity must be the result of mutations, whether evolution or young Earth creationism is true.
Now, look at this. Our book lists the sources of genetic variation. This page lists the 2 main sources of change as mutation and genetic recombination.
Recombination isn't really a source of new diversity in terms of new genes or new alleles for old genes, but it can cause existing genetics to get shuffled into new combinations, which can result in new phenotypes. So while the source for this variation is still mutations, I'm more or less okay with calling recombination a source of variation, as long as we recognize it is dependent on mutation.
So mutations would be accidents, errors?
Right. Mutations are usually caused when there's an error copying a creature's genetic information, which is found in its DNA. It can lose, duplicate, or even copy letters in the genetic code.
But if I delete, scramble, or duplicate letters, won't I eventually get a new word?
Oh great. Now we're about to get a disanalogy between human language and DNA. DNA being far less specific than human language. Never mind the fact that de novo gene creation has been observed by humans, but to be fair, that's just my prediction. Let's see where they actually go with this.
Sure, but a new word doesn't necessarily mean anything.
So if I scramble the letters in puppy, it just means gibberish?
Exactly. Mutations might be able to create a new combination of letters, but it needs to have a meaning for the cell to use as a blueprint later on.
Time for a bit of genetics 101. DNA is composed of a sugar phosphate backbone running on either side of the molecule, between which are base pairs composed of nitrogen phosphate groups. Each base pair can come in one of 4 types: adenine, A, thymine, T, guanine, G, or cytosine, C. Adenine and thymine are always opposite to each other, and guanine and cytosine are also always opposite to each other in a base pair. These sequences are grouped into sections of 3, each section being called a codon. This means there are 64 codons, and each codon has a particular assignment, coding to either start or stop transcription, or coding for one of the 20 amino acids that all life on Earth uses to make proteins. So any sequence of codons that has a start, some protein coding codons, and a stop can form a protein. In this way, the genetic code is extremely robust, and while proteins may end up malformed due to genetic mutations, they are still generally transcribable, and even, quote, malformed proteins can end up being useful in certain environments, especially when the protein is coded for by duplicate genes, only one of which mutates, leaving the organism with the original protein as well as a new, already complex protein which can now evolve a new function which may well involve the protein becoming more or less complex than the original one. So while the English language is not very robust and quickly becomes meaningless in written form with scrambled letters, the same simply isn't true for DNA. That's not to say that the genetic code is simple, it is far from it, but simplicity and robustness are not the same.
In other words, a code isn't really a code without some assigned meaning.
Well, I do use the phrase genetic code, but I will say that this is only by way of analogy. But even so, all codons have a meaning. There is no sequence of 3 base pairs which doesn't mean something. Granted, genes can still break such that there is not a functioning start or stop codon in the region they are contained in, and so they don't get transcribed. But it also happens that such regions can mutate to gain start and stop coda, allowing them to be transcribed into new proteins. So John here is just pushing the disanalogy between genetics and human language even further.
Gibberish can't create anything.
So mutations are always bad?
Yeah.
No.
There are so many documented beneficial mutations, I'm not even going to list them. But really, all I need to show that some of them can be beneficial is a quick definition and an example. A beneficial mutation is any mutation in an organism that provides a reproductive advantage compared to other members of the organism species in a given environment. So what might be beneficial in some circumstances may well be harmful in others. Whether a mutation is beneficial is always context dependent. But that being said, there are 3 beneficial mutations in humans I'd like to look at. The first 2 are pale skin in humans in cold environments. You might think that this is only a single mutation, but in fact pale skin in East Asia and parts of native populations in North America, and pale skin in Europe have different genetic bases. These mutations allow people in areas with low ultraviolet light to produce more vitamin D, which is a survival advantage in those areas. It also leaves them more prone to sunburn and skin cancer in areas with more UV light, and so would be a harmful mutation in such areas. The other mutation is lactose tolerance, which has the obvious advantage of allowing a new source of calorie-rich food to be consumed. But this would be harmful in areas without access to dairy since it makes weaning of children more difficult, which is why lactose intolerance is the default condition for all adult mammals. We know that these are mutations because of both their distribution in various particular populations of humans, as well as being able to sequence DNA from ancient humans to see what their genetics were like.
Look at what it says. Some mutations, such as those that cause genetic diseases, may be lethal. Other mutations may lower fitness by decreasing an individual's ability to survive and reproduce. Still, other mutations may improve an individual's ability to survive and reproduce.
It looks like they agree that mutations are bad, but then why do they say some may improve an individual?
No, they didn't agree that mutations are just bad in total. You just read the section where they said some can help. If they agreed that mutations were bad, that wouldn't be in there, and since we have already seen beneficial mutations, we know for a fact not all of them are harmful.
They give you an example right here. Over the past 20 years, mutations in the mosquito genome have made many African mosquitoes resistant to the chemical pesticides once used to control them.
Yeah, another example of a beneficial mutation. Thanks for doing my job, I guess.
Okay, so it looks like the mosquitoes are better off because of mutation.
Yes, but what they don't tell you is that resistance actually came from a loss of information in the mosquito's genetic code.
Information, a word that rivals only the word kind in terms of how infrequently it's ever given a useful definition by creationists. Creationists treat information as if it were some non-physical entity that exists in an ideal form in some spiritual realm, or something that any change in which represents a deviation from its Platonic ideal and therefore a reduction in information. Back in reality, though, the only way to use information theory to measure the information in the genetic code is to simply assign each base pair a value 1 through 4, which means every base pair is 2 bits of information, and the amount of information is the number of base pairs in the genome times 2 bits. So only deletion mutations actually lower the amount of information in the DNA.
The mosquito's ability to control its enzyme production is now messed up, and one of the strange side effects of too many enzymes is increased pesticide resistance.
I'm just going to assume that you're right, but you haven't shown how that's a loss of information. And yeah, that sounds like in the absence of those pesticides, that'd be a bad deal for the mosquitoes. But like I said, all mutations are only beneficial contextually. Organisms have to interact with the environment in which they find themselves, not some hypothetical ideal world. If mosquitoes are being sprayed with insecticides, then that's their environment, no matter what would be good for the mosquitoes or how their environment was before the spraying.
However, normal mosquitoes without the disease are much healthier in the wild where there is no pesticide.
Yeah, mosquitoes in a different environment are subject to different selection pressures. I feel like that's a pretty basic part of evolution. I'm not sure why you think that this aspect of the theory of evolution is a problem for the theory of evolution.
So it was a loss of information, but it was a benefit for those mosquitoes, right?
No, it's not right until you can define information in a useful way that lets us take an objective measure of it so we can compare any two genomes and tell which has more information, and by how much.
Well, they only benefit by being more resistant to the pesticide.
And since they live in an environment full of pesticides, that's a benefit. You don't get to say, oh, they only benefit because of their environment, so it's not a real benefit. The harm or benefit of mutations is dependent on the current environment.
The point is, by losing information, they lost control of an enzyme's production. Now, evolution needs to explain gains of information over time. And the same goes for other examples they give, like bacteria becoming more resistant, bone density, humans becoming more resistant to HIV.
How do you know any of these things resulted from a loss of information? There's no way you've given or even referenced in order to tell us how to measure such a thing. You might as well have said that all these mutations left the organism with less gorbalectionization. It's just meaningless unless you can objectively quantify it, tell us how you did it, and then we can go and do the same thing and get the same results you do. So far, that hasn't ever happened.
But if a population of creatures continues to lose information, could it be deadly for them?
Bingo! But here's the real problem.
Is the real problem that that sentence doesn't mean anything? Because you can't lose an undefined thing that no one has ever bothered to even attempt to measure?
People count on that loss of information from mutations to create the genetic blueprint for every living creature on Earth out of nothing. That's crazy.
No way, that's so impossible. It destroys evolution.
Right?
You're wrong. You're so wrong.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Exactly. It's not right. And I guess that's not the problem, but what you say the problem is means nothing. You have literally not made an argument because you neglected to define your terms. This is why when I asked Standing for Truth to debate whether mutations can cause an increase in information, he declined and instead offered to debate on evolution. The only way we have of defining information measurably means that any mutation that results in more base pairs in a piece of DNA is an increase in information. But clearly, that's not what creationists mean. But what they really mean is that they're going to use some undefined kind of information, because they can say nothing, but have it sound intuitively bad, and thereby trick people into thinking there is some problem for evolution here.
Okay, so what about the other changes? Program change, or you called it genetic recombination.
Look at what it says here. Most heritable differences are due not to mutations, but to genetic recombination. So, God not only created all the animals, he also packed them with enough genetic information that would allow them to adapt to different environments and varieties we see today.
But then, according to you, he killed off nearly all of them, leaving behind a vanishingly small amount of genetic diversity compared to what we see today, meaning that even if you're right, nearly all of modern genetic diversity in all organisms must be new diversity that has arisen through mutation in the time since your imagined flood.
So adaptation is real?
Yeah, I saw an explanation of it in the Focus on Earth Science. Individuals with characteristics that are poorly suited to the environment are less likely to survive and reproduce.
Over time, poorly suited characteristics may disappear from the species.
So a population of animals can adapt by expressing variety over time, but there are limits to how much they can change.
In what way?
Think about rolling dice. If you had 2 dice, you could roll anything between 2 and 12. The variety is programmed into the dice, but you can't roll anything higher or lower.
Yeah, selection works to drive down genetic diversity in a manner that leaves the resulting population with less diversity if taken on its own. But as we've already seen, mutations work to increase diversity, a fact that even your pseudo-historical beliefs require to be true, and that has been observed in the real world in actual organisms.
I get what you're saying. Likewise, animals can express a lot of variety, but there's a limit because of the finite genetic information they have.
Exactly.
There's a limit to what can be selected at any given time, but across time, mutations provide new material for selection to act on.
And while we've seen some pretty amazing varieties within the kinds God created, like in dogs, one basic kind of animal can never change into another.
Well, you've already shown more variation in dogs than can be accounted for based on the Noah's Ark story. Plus, you have never given anyone a way to objectively determine what a kind is. So, you coupled an image that proves you wrong with a statement that means nothing. Good job. I see now why so many politicians are creationists. They already have practice at saying things that sound reasonable, but don't actually mean anything.
And that fits with all the examples we see in these textbooks.
Although they like to point out the differences in finch beaks and tortoises.
It's just adaptation within the genetic limits of that kind.
Right.
Wrong, since there's no such thing as a kind. You're just using these observed instances of organisms obeying the evolutionary law of monophily, which states that an organism can never outgrow its ancestry, and pretending that this adherence to the laws of evolution is some kind of problem for evolution. In fact, if a tortoise were to become a meerkat, that would disprove the modern synthesis of evolution. Granted, it also wouldn't be a big win for biblical creationism if that happened.
But then they pass it off as evolution. And you know, I used to think that all these arguments really showed evolution, but then I got to thinking.
Let me guess. You got to thinking that you didn't actually know what evolution was, and that if you made up terms like kind and information, but never bothered to actually give them definitions that could be used to learn anything about the real world, it let you more easily accept that obviously not literally true stories were literally true, which made your theology more childishly simple. I mean, to be honest, that's the only way that this can lead someone to think that evolution isn't true.
Studying changes in a beak shape, like Darwin's finches, won't show you where that beak came from. And despite the minor changes, a finch is still just a finch.
Yeah, I think I was right here, and you're just being dishonest. But in fact, the same mechanism that created the variety in beak shape created the beak. In fact, we have a great series of fossils showing dinosaurs with and without beaks, and beaks of varying size, including aviolans, getting more and more prominent beaks and losing teeth.
Is it just me, or does the evolutionary tree seem more like an orchard?
I promise, it's just you. The same way you can look at organisms today and recognize them as related, you can look at larger groupings and also recognize them as related. Any cutoff point to this process is arbitrary until creationists can find objectively quantifiable ways to tell what should and shouldn't be related, and then confirm that.
Organizing animals. It's like Carl Linnaeus.
Who's that?
Yeah, he was the first guy to classify animals.
Oh, yeah, I remember him now. His motto was, God created, Linnaeus ordered.
Yeah, his work is the basis for the classification system we still use today. Yeah, later, Charles Darwin sketched a diagram to show how life started simple and then branched out to every creature on Earth.
Yup, that was his motto. And I think you somewhat mischaracterized that diagram. It's just supposed to illustrate common ancestry, which does not necessarily involve increasing complexity.
He said the different branches represent the different levels of classification. A tree of life, if you will.
A tree that objectively exists in the real world. And isn't it odd how little of Linnaeus' work has been overturned? At least in terms of the group or taxa he identified. Sure, some of it has changed, but virtually all of the taxa he identified are still recognized today as valid clades, with only minor modifications. Linnaeus was a good scientist, so good, he got in some trouble with the ecclesiastics of his day, and even decided not to put humans into the ape category, just to avoid further trouble. Although, he originally had both orangutans and chimpanzees in the genus Homo.
Oh yeah, I keep seeing this over and over again in our textbooks.
Really?
Yeah. Here we go. Check out this one.
Are researchers still trying to figure out how it happened?
Yes and no. There are still some mysteries in the tree of life, especially in how certain closely related groups fit into the pattern relative to each other.
and how certain fossil forms are related to each other and today's organisms? Overall, though, the picture is pretty clear. We're really not going to find out someday that dogs are more closely related to humans than they are to horses. At that level, there's really not much question left.
There are a lot more of these diagrams. I think they change as different researchers group them based on different features.
These charts show groups of organisms they believe share a common ancestor.
Yeah, the details of a cladogram can change as more data is included or various models are used to assess them. That's what you call science. You don't just stick to whatever somewhat incorrect conclusion you got first and then just don't change it to fit new data. I get really tired of creationists complaining that science changes. That's a good thing. Things that update to take advantage of new information are good things. Things that just stay wrong forever are bad things. Why would you want to be wrong just so you don't have to change your conclusions? That's a terrible way to live and a worse way to run a society.
Yeah, a group like that is called a clade, and these diagrams are called cladograms.
Well, all organisms have a common ancestor, but a chart that big would be too big to fit meaningfully on paper, and if we are only considering a smaller group of organisms than the whole of life, they'll likely share a more recent common ancestor than the last common ancestor of all life. For example, the image you showed was of Arctoidea, including 2 musceloids, the lesser panda from family Iluridae, and raccoons, or family Procyonidae, and 2 ursids, that is, bears. One the giant panda, and the other confusingly labeled bears, but looking like an American brown bear. As we can see, the musceloids have a common ancestor, as do the ursids, and both of these common ancestors have their own Arctoidean common ancestor.
So, remember that modern evolutionary classification is a rapidly changing science with a difficult goal: to present all life on a single evolutionary tree. As evolutionary biologists study relationships among taxa, they regularly change not only the way organisms are grouped, but also sometimes the name of groups. Remember that cladograms are visual presentations of hypotheses about relationships and not hard and fast facts.
Whoa, whoa, whoa. You're saying our textbooks say that cladograms are based off hypotheses, not facts.
What is this? Actual information about cladistics? That's my job, you two. Start saying nonsense already.
Yeah, I'll show you why. Flip forward a page. That's because they only have living animals or fossils for certain places on the branches.
Hypothesis isn't a synonym for guess. A hypothesis is also a conclusion. After evidence is gathered and examined, the conclusion you reach is a hypothesis. This hypothesis can then be tested. The result of the testing is a new conclusion, which is a new hypothesis that better fits the available data. All a hypothesis is a possible and plausible idea for what may be the case given the current evidence. It is always based on evidence, and it is always a conclusion based on evidence. How badly can one pair of humans misunderstand science?
These are real animals or fossils we've actually discovered. But these branching points are just imaginary lines that represent the hypotheses about which animals evolved from a common ancestor.
I don't even understand what that's supposed to tell me about this idea that cladograms aren't based on evidence. Fossils and living organisms are evidence. Carolus Linnaeus made what was a cladogram in all but name without any fossils, and he got it pretty well correct in most places, all without genetics or fossils. And most of what has been discovered has confirmed his findings. It's just that that's not as interesting as the times it hasn't, so you tend to hear about the exceptions.
No facts support them that can't also support different links, or no link.
The reason we don't place known forms as the common ancestor is that in most cases there's no way to know for sure who that ancestor was. For example, let's say that your ancestry is from Japan, and so was that of your friend. As far as you know, you two aren't related, but as it turns out, you both take a DNA test, and, hey, what do you know? You're fourth cousins. Well, that's cool. You share at least one great-great-great-grandparent. You decide to investigate. So you get all 8 of your collective grandparents to also take a DNA test to see which of them are cousins. And you find out. Unfortunately, though, the ones who match have slightly conflicting stories about exactly what their names of their ancestors are. So you do some digging and find the town that they all came from. Let's just say it's Sasebo. Literally only because I've personally been there. Well, now you can see who was around in Sasebo at the time of your great-great-great-grandparents. Some of them are more or less related to you, and you find 10 candidates, all of whom were the right age and in the right place to be your ancestors. But which of them is it? You can't really find out, and since they were almost certainly cremated, you probably can't even test their DNA. At this point, you're stuck. You have some potential ancestors, but you can't tell which of them it is, and you can't even really be sure it's any of them. So, do you have evidence about your family and relationship to your friend that you didn't have before? Of course you do, even though you still can't identify an exact ancestor. Similarly, in organisms, things like character analysis and DNA analysis can determine relatedness, and we can find intermediate forms in the fossil record that match the description of a common ancestor, and that is around at about the right time. But we can't do a DNA sequence, so we don't know which, if any, of the forms we found is actually the ancestor of modern forms. But it still means we have gained useful knowledge about the ancestry of these organisms.
The transitional fossils they represent have never been found. If they were, well, we'd see their pictures here, right?
No.
Many facts support them. In fact, cladograms are based on pages of quantifiable data from either DNA, morphology, or both, and are constructed via a few different methods, and each method tends to yield a similar, although usually not identical, tree. There is no question that all mammals share a common ancestor with each other more recently than they do with birds. The evidence supporting any cladogram is voluminous. Try reading a paper in the phylogenetic systematics literature. The amount of data used is often staggering. So much so that the analysis of it must be machine-assisted. Ain't nobody got time for that.
Though evolutionists point to a few examples, there should be thousands.
First, transitional forms are all over the place. See? In fact, some of them, like Archaeopteryx, Tiktaalik, Probanognathus, and Pakicetus, were predicted. But you know where they fall in a cladogram with their living relatives? At the tip of branches. Because, just like with your potential grandparents in Japan, we can't know for sure which, if any of them, are the actual ones at the nodes. But we know they're in the right ballpark.
Genesis 1:21 says, "So God created great sea creatures and every living thing that moves, with which the waters abounded, according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good."
Really, we don't need any transitional fossils, or any fossils at all, in order to adequately confirm evolution. But how many transitional forms do you need and why to confirm that, say, rhinoceroses, or should that be rhinoceroi, and horses have a common ancestor? We have about a dozen fossil species, and the DNA of the living animals. Should we have more? How many? The fact is we don't need any. They're just nice to have. But it will never be enough for creationists. Every transitional form found is a confirmation of evolution. So, if you want us to take creationism seriously, start predicting some fossils that evolution would say shouldn't exist. Then go find them. Do that, and I'll start taking you seriously when you complain about how the numerous transitional fossils we have don't actually count because you keep shifting the goalpost.
From the beginning, God created fully formed kinds of animals.
Okay, but Genesis isn't evidence in science. Hard data is evidence in science. If Genesis informs your ideas about what may have happened, that's fine, but you're going to have to back it up with actual findings from the real world. In order to know if your interpretation of the Bible is reasonable, it has to be subjected to both the tests of the rest of the Bible and reality. If it's not compatible with both, then either the Bible is wrong or your interpretation is wrong. Either way, you're wrong in such a case. So reality always has to test your idea about what's true based on the Bible, or you'll never know if you're right. Sure, I can't force you to do this, but if you don't, you'll only ever be right by accident.
So, it isn't a tree like Darwin thought. Instead, it's an orchard.
Then demonstrate that. Show which organisms are from a kind, how we know, why they can't be related,
Then publish that and see if other people get the same results or if they can shoot you down. I have my own suspicions about what would happen if you did that, but you won't, so it doesn't matter.
God created the different kinds of animals, and then they expressed all types of amazing variety as they bred within their kind.
And recombining genetic possibilities that God packed into the original kinds produced that variety?
But even in your orchard, you're drawing cladograms. You have no way to put anything at those nodes either, so how do you know your trees are valid? How do you know if someone connecting two of them together is wrong? You don't, and you can't. Any point where you cut off a cladogram and declare that the ancestors beyond that are fake and that the cladistics after that are valid is arbitrary. Why are apes all related to each other, but not other old-world monkeys? Why are the ceratopsians related to each other, but not to pachycephalosaurs? No reason. You just thought that it seemed like a place that your ill-informed audience wouldn't object to.
Exactly. We see variation happening all the time, but we've never seen the evolutionary process of mutations and selection creating new kinds.
Hey, that's something I covered in the last episode about natural selection and mutations. Check out episode 7 of Genesis Apologetics Should Apologize. It's fully badly animated.
So dogs, apes, and people can show variety, but can never morph into a new kind.
Well, we've seen them create new species, and since you've never bothered to give us a way to tell if a kind has been created, I guess you didn't actually say anything with that statement.
Yep, just like the orchard. One basic tree kind can never become another. Scientists seem to name something a new species, even if there's only a minor change.
Well, humans are apes. In fact, they're not even a sister group to the other apes. They're grouped with the chimpanzees and bonobos, and then all 3 of those species group with the gorillas before they do with the orangutans. Then all 6 of the great apes group together with each other before they do with the lesser apes. Already, you failed at identifying a kind. But further, are you imagining that some animals will cross from, say, ape to dog? Because that's just not how evolution works. Organisms can speciate, leading to the founding of new clades, but they can't climb back up the family tree to go down a different branch and join a clade that they were never part of. Dogs can't become apes, they will always be dogs. Even if they diversify into flying forms or aquatic forms or animals that only eat grass, they'll still be dogs, although you might not know it at first glance.
And in the fossils, the smallest variation is classified as a different species, even though we see lots of variety with some species today.
Look, where to draw the line between species isn't easy. It's almost like speciation is usually a gradual process where you can't draw a hard line and say, now there are 2 species. But it also clearly happens. In fact, even creationists accept that it happens, which of course means that they accept macroevolution.
Like what?
Like in dogs. Just think about all the variety in the breeds of dog kinds, Canis familiaris, in the last 200 years.
I actually agree that paleontologists are too quick to name a new species. I get it that since there's no way to prove that the variation isn't a new species, and that it's cool to be able to name a new species, that this is probably a problem that's not going anywhere anytime soon. But yeah, paleontologists probably have named more species than is warranted, and we know for a fact that they've sometimes called growth stages new species.
If future paleontologists dug up the bones of a bulldog, a chihuahua, and a Great Dane, they would surely classify them as 3 different species. But they are all the same kind.
Okay, hold up. Picking dogs isn't quite fair either. Dogs have an outrageous and artificial degree of physical variation. If you want a more reasonable comparison, try looking at the natural variation in the gray wolf excluding dogs, that is Canis lupus, or in Panthera tigris, the tiger. These are species with a wide but not exaggerated diversity in morphology. And yes, if we found their fossils, it's likely that the Arctic wolf and the Asiatic wolf would be classed as different species, and that the Sumatran tiger and the Bengal tiger would be classified as different species. First, I could make a decent argument that they actually are different species, since they couldn't interbreed without artificial help, and so their gene pools would be isolated by nature. Although for the bulldog, they just can't breed at all without human aid, and so they're less of a species and more of an abomination spawned from the darkest places of the human soul, whose mere existence should bring mortals to the precipice of madness and despair. Anyway, second, so is kind now down to a subspecies? Because those are all Canis lupus domesticus, even though you stupidly think that Canis domesticus is still a valid taxon. Because if a kind is a subspecies, then I hate to break it to you, but you can create a new kind of vertebrate in your lifetime with some careful breeding.
Whether beaks of a finch change shape or a color of a moth, the changes are limited.
Limited by what? What prevents a moth from changing the color and shape of its wings, the shape of its eyes, the shape of its antennae, and the silk produced during the shift from larva to pupa stage? Nothing that I know of.
Yet these are the differences between butterflies and moths, animals most creationists don't think are in the same kind. Similarly, what prevents an amphicyonid from walking more on its toes and becoming a dog? Or what prevents it from getting bigger and a shorter tail and becoming a bear? See, that's the thing. These differences are all things that are entirely reasonable. There's no hard barrier between kinds, and when you get to the more basal members of various groups in the fossil record, it shows that the difference between various groups of organisms is far more slight and superficial than the average creationist is comfortable with. For example, you might think that the differences between horses and rhinos are vast, but in the earliest fossils of both groups, the only real difference is in the shape of the molars. Evolution always proceeds by adding superficial divergence over top deeper homology.
When it's just expressing variety within the created kind.
Yup, so evolutionists consider adjustments to existing traits evidence that evolution made those traits in the first place.
All evolution is adjustments to existing traits. That's sufficient to explain the whole of biodiversity. It really is. You might think that the transition from what's basically a sponge to a human involves a lot of new stuff, and in some ways that's true, but in a fundamental way, every step involved only modifying what came before it to make it a bit different. And all along that way, other organisms were making different minor changes and branching off and growing increasingly different from their cousins.
So, what if God made each basic kind with potential to change some of its traits, but no potential to morph into a different kind? Dogs can breed with coyotes, and coyotes can breed with wolves. They call it a coy-wolf, so they must all be part of the same created kind. So they have a common ancestor, but it was the original dog kind that God created.
But not all dogs can breed with each other, unless by dog you mean only the Canis genus, in which case kind goes all the way down to genus. But the thing is that reproductive isolation has been observed happening in actual organisms. In the case of polyploidy, it can happen in as little as a single generation. So we know that reproductive compatibility can't be the diagnostic by which we judge whether there's a common ancestor, because we know for certain of organisms that can't breed but had a common ancestor. And we know because we were there.
Not the transition between a reptile and a mammal, like they show in these textbooks.
Ugh. Stay tuned, because I'm going to cover the reptile-mammal transition later, probably as an episode of Things That Aren't Dinosaurs. Suffice it to say that since they haven't ever defined a kind, and all the changes between primitive amniotes and modern mammals are just modification of what's already there, like they said that they accepted, there's no reason that this poses a problem, even based on their own definitions.
So fossils, the classification of animals, and the Bible are all in harmony.
That's what it looks like.
I mean, sure, as long as you change your interpretation of the Bible. I don't really think that the Bible has as one of its goals the systematic classification of living organisms.
Is it just me, or is it impossible to line up animals in the way they evolved?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that's such a poorly worded question that I honestly don't even know what would count as lining up animals the way they evolved. Like, lining up modern animals in some sort of order? Well, they didn't evolve from each other, so I'm not sure how that would be done. Do you mean line animals up with their fossil relatives to show morphological change over time? That's pretty easy, but I'm not sure that that's what you mean.
They only make a few different house plans that they repeat throughout the whole neighborhood.
Okay, I never knew that.
Yeah, it reminds me of homologous structures.
Of course, me too. What are you talking about?
Jane actually asks a good question. Homologous structures do not need to be morphologically identical, and houses do not grow organically according to a pattern of signaling mechanisms determining how they grow, fold, and die in various parts. So the similarity of houses in tract housing is not very much analogous to homology in living organisms.
Sorry, I was just studying it in our textbook. So, what's the term homo mean?
Homos is Greek for same.
Right, and logos means relation. So homologous means having the same relation.
And that was in our textbook?
Yeah, no, it says right here in the biology book, homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. That is, a similar structure in two organisms can be found in the common ancestor of the organisms.
So they say the penguin, alligator, bat, and human all evolved from a common vertebrate ancestor because they have similar bones in their forelimbs.
Well, it's not just that the limbs are similar, it's that they have the same bones in the same order and that they develop in the same manner from the embryo. For example, a bat wing and a bird wing are homologous as forelimbs, because of all of those things. But they're also similar as wings. They have similar overall shape, function, and use as wings. but they are not homologous as wings, because the parts of the animal used to form the flight surface and power the flapping, etc., are fundamentally different parts of the anatomy in each animal, and do not develop from the same embryonic parts.
That's quite a family. So, imagine the job evolutionists have. They must take the entire animal kingdom and try to determine which creatures evolved from others.
No, they have to take all of life, not just animals, and determine which organisms are more closely related to others by a common ancestor. If we look at the examples your textbook used, a penguin, an alligator, a bat, and a human, the penguin and the alligator are both closer to each other than they are to the other two, both being archosaurs. And the bat and the human are closer to each other than they are to either the penguin or the alligator, both being eutherians. Together, though, they are all more closely related to each other than any of them are to a frog, all of them being amniotes, while the frog is a lissamphibian. But the frog didn't evolve into any of them, nor did the alligator evolve into the penguin or any other such combination. They share common ancestors, and given the limitations of the fossil record, we can't say for certain if we have found that particular ancestor, even if we find fossil forms that are morphologically similar to what we would expect such an ancestor to look like.
Okay, so they look for these homologous structures to show an evolutionary relationship.
You got it.
Yeah, actually, she does get it better than John does. Homology tells you about common ancestry, not which modern form evolved into which other modern form, because that's not how evolution works.
And they would look convincing, but look at the definition of homologous.
Homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry.
Oh, are you about to point out that given that definition of homology, using homology to determine evolutionary relationships is circular? Because, yeah, I can say it is. Your textbook for kids wasn't careful in its definition. Homology is not determined by assuming common ancestry. What is looked for is the pattern of the feature across taxa as well as the way these features develop in embryo. Conveniently, the degree of homology between taxa lines up quite well with other lines of evidence such as genetics, and so is in fact excellent evidence for both the fact of common ancestry as well as for which organisms are more closely related to other particular organisms.
Sometimes we see structures with similar functions in creatures that don't come from a supposed common ancestor.
Maybe I got that one wrong. But yes, features with similar functions but different anatomy are called analogous. Like I said before, a bat wing and a bird wing are homologous as forelimbs, but analogous as wings.
Got an example?
I do. A human and a squid eye.
What?
Both humans and squid have a lens that projects an image onto a retina. The problem is that evolutionary theory holds that the closest ancestor to both didn't have eyes, but only a patch of light-sensitive skin cells.
Yep, the common ancestor of both would probably be bilaterian, an animal that most likely had a pair of eye patches connected to a neural web, that may or may not have had a ganglion functioning as a rudimentary brain. The early split between protostomata and deuterostomata likely happened before these eye patches had time to develop much beyond their basal form. This explains why there are fundamental differences in the anatomy of squid and human eyes, such as the arrangement of blood vessels, or the fact that squid eyes may well use chromatic aberration and only a single type of light receptor cell to detect color, whereas humans use multiple light receptors tuned to different wavelengths to detect color. These are major differences, and ones that develop differently in embryo. In fact, the embryonic development of cephalopods and humans have virtually no similarities after the development of the trypoblast structure of 3 cell layers in the embryo.
That means that a very similar eye had to evolve twice, completely independent from each other.
They're functionally similar, but like I said, there are major differences. And since eyes are so very useful and evolved at least 4 times independently that I can think of, I'm not sure how you think this is an argument.
They call this convergent evolution and believe that the same process of random mutations happening over millions of years built similar structures.
No way! An eye's so amazing, it seems impossible that it could have evolved in the first place.
Your incredulity is not an argument. Be honest. If someone said that they didn't believe in Jesus because his miracles seemed too fantastic to be believed, do you think that would be a good argument against Christianity? I doubt you would. And the fact is that there is way more evidence for evolution than there is for any of the miracles in the Bible, whether or not they occurred.
But now they believe it happened twice?
Yep, that would be impossible. Times 2.
Well, as I explained in the last video, it's not impossible. And since it's not impossible twice, or 4 times, or more.
Are there other examples of similar looking organs that don't fit evolutionary trees?
No, because analogous structures do fit the trees. You yourselves said that the common ancestor of humans and squid only had eye patches in common in terms of visual organs. So the fact that they shared so little in common means that we would expect the analogous features in any structure between them, much more complicated than muscle fibers that do the same function in either animal, to be quite different in their anatomy. This is exactly what we do see. Just as homology can be used to link organisms, analogy can be used to show that they are likely distant from each other.
Oh yeah, lots. Think about flight. Man, with all his intelligence, just figured out how to fly less than 200 years ago. But flight supposedly evolved at least 4 different times. Birds, insects, mammals, like bats, and reptilian flight, like pterodactyls.
Yup, and the way that we tell that these things are independent and not either the same design by the same designer or actually all the same evolution of flight with later divergence into separate lines of flyers is exactly because the wings are not homologous. If we were to assume the same design, same designer argument usually used in the context of homology, then we would expect insects, birds, bats, and pterosaurs to have fundamentally similar wing structures, instead of all of them having very different wing structures. Although in the cases of birds, bats, and pterosaurs, the wings are in fact homologous as forelimbs, just not as wings.
Now that makes it 4 times impossible.
Except it's not impossible times 1, so it's not impossible times 4. You don't just get to assert that your incredulity makes something impossible. And even if your incredulity were an argument against the evolution of flight being possible, it doesn't become a better argument when flight is proposed to have evolved more than once.
So, going back to the human and squid eye, would they be called homologous structures since they look similar?
Nope. When similar structures are found on creatures that aren't considered closely related, they are called convergent.
Well, it's more accurate to say that there are analogous features that resulted from convergent evolution, but sure. And it's not just that they are similar, it's that they have similar function with different anatomy. If you found an insect with bat wings, like a sturge from Dungeons & Dragons, then yeah, that'd pretty much wreck evolution, because those wings would be homologous despite the fact that nothing on the level of a wing should be homologous between insects and bats.
So they evolved completely independent from each other?
Yeah. Evolution supposedly built the same basic organ more than one time.
Are you ever going to mention that part where evolution did this using different anatomy, which is the whole point of why it actually does fit extremely well with the predictions of evolution?
But it sounds more like a rescuing device, like a make-believe story than a scientific concept.
Yeah, lots of things sound silly when you strawman them. Like if I said Christianity is the belief that a dead Middle Easterner will give you skin cookies and blood wine every week if you ask his ghost to possess you, you'd probably object to that characterization of your religion. And you know what? So would most people who know anything about Christianity but aren't Christians. Similarly, you shouldn't start with a description of evolution or its concepts that no one who is knowledgeable about them would accept as accurate.
So how do you know the difference between when similar structures are homologous and when they're analogous?
I'm not sure.
Homologous structures have the same basic anatomy and develop from the same embryonic structures. Analogous structures have the same function but different anatomy and embryonic development.
It says here, homologous structures are structures that share a common ancestry. But how can anyone be sure that structures actually shared a common ancestry?
By checking if they are variations on the same anatomy. I highly doubt that this isn't explained on the next page of the textbook, but somehow I feel like we aren't going to see that anytime soon.
When similarities fit evolution, there are homologous structures. But when they don't fit, they claim the structure evolved more than once?
No.
No, they do fit. It's just that you haven't bothered to explain to your audience the structural differences that allow scientists to distinguish between homologous and analogous structures. And honestly, the fact that we're this far into the video and you haven't even made the attempt makes me think that you're just being dishonest. For the first time in this series, I'm legitimately angry. This level of dishonesty is just beyond anything I expected, even from professional creationists. This might be beyond even Hovind levels of dishonesty. But then, since Dan Biddle, the head of Genesis Apologetics, recently appeared on Kent Hovind's Whack an Atheist episode about Richard Dawkins and whale evolution, perhaps I shouldn't be that surprised.
Wow, that's circular reasoning.
No, you've confused your own straw man with circular reasoning on the part of people who know far more than you do, and are far more honest about what they do know and don't know.
How so?
Their evolutionary theory decides what is homologous, and then they say homologous structures prove evolution.
Hey, that's right. That's really messed up.
So how do creationists explain similar structures?
The same way they do everything else, by saying God did it and just leaving it at that. Although I'm sure they'll use more words than that to make it sound fancy, but won't bother to give those words a rigorous definition.
Simple. They share the same master designer, God. God built similarly designed features into his creatures, making sure each feature was precisely tailored to fit that creature's systems.
Then why do pterosaurs like Nyctosaurus and Pteranodon have wings that are so much like an albatross in shape and aspect ratio, and that likely perform the same function, that of low power distance over ocean flight, but that are so different in terms of anatomy? A common designer would reuse designs rather than retrofitting previous designs into new forms when they need the same function over again. Analogous features simply do not fit with the idea that these organisms share a common designer.
It's like airplanes, skateboards, cars, and motorcycles. They all need wheels and tires, but designers made them different to tailor them to each vehicle's unique specifications.
Except all those times when organs have the same design specifications and radically different design, like hummingbird wings and butterfly wings.
It's also like the similarities between yours and Carrie's house. They were designed by the same architect for the same purpose.
Oh, so squid eyes and human eyes should be pretty similar in terms of their basic layout. That's a good novel prediction of the special creation hypothesis. Too bad it's already been falsified. I guess we can toss out the idea of special creation. And there it is, the last video in the series. I can't say I'll miss these two, and in my opinion this episode was the worst. So I guess it makes sense that they'd go out with it. Just because this series is done doesn't mean that there won't be plenty more stuff to come from me, so remember to like this video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and perhaps most importantly, share this video with people you think would like it, or even people you think would hate it. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Thanks for watching. Before you go, I'd like to take a minute to thank my patrons, especially my $20 patrons, Ben Tovand, Bob Knob, The Evil Scotsman, Henry Hutanen, Chris Love, and Res Instance. If you'd like to help me make videos like this, why don't you head over to my Patreon. I have tiers starting as low as $1 and going all the way up to $100. You'll get access to my Discord, as well as some other exclusive items that only my patrons get to see. You'll also occasionally get early access to my videos. If a monthly subscription isn't right for you, but you'd still like to help out, you can check out my merch store or my Amazon.com wishlist, both of which are linked in the description. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur.
You found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.